Here's something you've probably heard a lot of in the last few months. Russia is running out of tanks. But while this refrain was once something of a joke, now, more than half a year into the invasion of Ukraine, it looks like a new reality, and you won't believe how bad it's gotten. As of August 2023, the numbers are truly staggering. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia has lost an estimated 4,330 tanks and 8,400 armored combat vehicles, not to mention over 250,000 soldiers. While these numbers are likely inflated to some degree, anything even close to these figures represents most of the country's pre-war supply of armor and will have long-lasting implications for both Russia and the international community. Similarly, a recent open-source investigation by Norwegian researcher Ragnar Gudmundsson shows that Russia is definitely relying on more and more older tanks. He found that in the first days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 71% of the lost tanks accounted for vehicles modernized or produced in the Russian Federation, and just 29% were Soviet-era models. However, as of June 2023, it was a very different situation. 73% of lost Russian tanks originated from the Soviet Union, while only 27% were newer types. This strongly suggests that Russian tank supplies have reached a tipping point, where they can no longer be replaced. It could also change the dynamics of this grinding conflict, potentially signaling that the Russian war effort is finally running out of steam. So let's dive into how this happened and just what it means for the future of the war in Ukraine. But first, let's take a second to talk about the invisible war every one of us is waging every day. Just like on the battlefield, in this digital era, where every move is traceable, you might feel cornered. But today's video sponsor, Surfshark VPN, offers a way out. Surfshark VPN is more than a privacy tool. It's your passport to the global internet. By encrypting all the data that's transmitted between your device and the web, it ensures your sensitive information remains inaccessible to snooping entities, be it tech giants or cybercriminals. Plus, with Surfshark, you can change your device's location, virtually traveling worldwide. With more than 3,200 servers across 100 countries, Surfshark lets you unblock streaming services like Netflix. Vacationing abroad? Simply relocate virtually to your home country. And for those in restricted zones, Surfshark breaks down digital walls completely, granting you unrestricted internet freedom. The web can be a dangerous place, especially on public Wi-Fi, but Surfshark acts as your online bodyguard. It encrypts data, obscures your IP, and with the Clean Web feature, you can evade ads, malware, and pesky trackers. Most importantly, Surfshark respects your privacy by not storing any activity logs. And for an added layer of protection, check out their supplementary tools like Alert, Antivirus, and Search. And Surfshark has a special deal for our viewers. Use code MilitaryShow and get an additional 3 months for free. Don't worry, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, giving you ample time to test the waters. The link's waiting for you in the description below, so why wait? Take control of your online journey with Surfshark VPN today. Alright, let's circle back to Putin's ongoing battle to hang on to his tanks. And honestly, by now, there's no surprises here. This guy's lack of skill is starting to feel like an endless saga. Reports over the summer have confirmed that Russian tank losses are so heavy that the country has moved many of its ancient Soviet tanks out of storage. This includes the T-54 and T-55, which are more than 75 years old and essentially obsolete in today's combat environments. Back when it made its battlefield debut, the T-55 was a highly effective tank, but it entered service just after the Second World War, soon becoming one of the most highly produced tanks ever, with an estimated 100,000 built over the next few decades. As a result, the T-55 played a role in just about every single conflict during the Cold War period, and frightened Western countries so much that they rushed to mass-produce their own battle tanks. It was also built to survive just about anything, with a massive 205mm of frontal turret armor and 120mm of slanted hull armor. This armor is so tough that the tank itself survived tests with a 15-kiloton nuclear explosion at only 300 meters away. The T-55 also has a 100mm gun, which was once a threat to anything in the NATO arsenal. But that was the 1950s. Today's modern tank systems make the T-55 look like junk, and there is little question which would prevail in a head-to-head battle. That's not to mention that T-55s also included a so-called jack-in-the-box flaw, which has doomed many of Russia's other Soviet-era tanks. Unlike modern battle tanks such as the German Leopard 2 or US M1 Abrams, which keep their shells away from the crew behind thick armored walls, older Soviet tanks store their ammunition in a carousel-style automatic loader sitting directly below the main turret and crew. A well-placed shot to their thin roof armor can ignite the ammunition and easily blow up the tank. As Professor Robert E. Hamilton of the US Army War College put it bluntly, for a Russian crew, if the ammo storage compartment is hit, everyone is dead. He adds that the force of the explosion will instantaneously vaporize anyone unlucky enough to be inside. So why has Russia been forced to rely on these death trap antiques, and what in the world happened to all its decent tanks? The short answer is that Ukraine happened. The long answer is that years of poor combat doctrine and failure to learn from past mistakes have made Ukraine's stunning success much easier than anyone predicted. Russia's initial offensive into the country last year was nothing short of a disaster, with endless strategic and tactical blunders, and ineffective approaches to modern urban and semi-urban combat. This was reflected strongly in the performance of its tank units. Battle tanks are one of the most effective and critical weapons in modern warfare. While jets and bombers are more destructive, they cannot be used to hold and control territory in the same way that a tank can. The main gun of a tank can pin down enemies and even level buildings. Some tanks have specialized rounds intended to do just that. Composite tank armor is also incredibly tough, using layers and structural reinforcement to stop anything short of another tank blast or very well-placed missile. And anything a tank is able to blow apart, it can also roll over, making most low cover ineffective. But for all their power, tanks can easily be stopped without proper support. Russia has continually failed to learn this lesson, which helps account for the abysmal performance of its tanks in Ukraine. And by taking advantage of this reality, Ukrainian defenders were able to pull off some of their most astonishing victories of the war. But while this has become obvious to most observers since February 2022, Russia's failure to properly utilize its tanks actually has quite an embarrassing history. For instance, during the First Chechen War of 1994 to 1996, Russia mobilized its enormous arsenal of Soviet tanks to try and crush the smaller and less equipped Chechen forces. But as Russian troops discovered all the way back then, superior numbers and equipment don't mean very much when executed badly. Lacking their own tanks, Chechen rebels instead relied on anti-tank missiles, RPGs, tank mines, and even improvised explosive devices. Much as Ukraine has, they also use this limited toolkit to take advantage of major weaknesses in Russian warfighting doctrine. This doctrine relies on tanks leading the way of every ground assault, with infantry fighting vehicles behind providing close support. But the usefulness of infantry support is greatly diminished when troops are stuck inside vehicles, leaving them unable to detect ambushes or respond quickly. In Chechnya, rebels took advantage of this by fighting in urban environments and using guerrilla tactics to fire from many positions at once. Firing from above also allows them to target the thin armor on the tank's roofs, often resulting in devastating ambushes. Russia's enormous casualties from a tank-heavy warfighting doctrine with no effective infantry support would be repeated during the Second Chechen War only years later. Russia was able to secure eventual victory in both these conflicts by using brutal artillery strikes and the huge size of its armed forces to seize and hold the capital Grozny. But the wars showed some fundamental weaknesses which many people failed to pay attention to. As Olga Oleka, an analyst from the RAND Corporation, wrote way back in 2001 that failure to prepare for urban combat was a key error the Russians made in both Chechnya wars, but it was far from the only one. Hampered by poor training and supplies, decrepit equipment, and abysmal planning, the 1994–96 war presented a stark picture of how much this once great force had deteriorated. It also demonstrated how poorly the Russian military organizational structures functioned when disparate forces were called upon to work together. Sound familiar? It should, because today not a single one of these underlying issues had been addressed. Throughout the early 21st century, Russian combat doctrine continually relied on heavy tanks without adequate infantry support, counting on the use of superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm smaller enemies. Issues with training, supplies, equipment, and planning were never addressed, while Putin's kleptocratic dictatorship funneled huge chunks of the military budget into oligarchs' bank accounts. Fast forward to 2022, and it's pretty easy to see how the invasion of Ukraine was a disaster waiting to happen. Ukraine is far bigger than Chechnya, while its military is just as fiercely determined and tactically flexible as the rebels were. Ukrainian war planners also took advantage of the same weaknesses, drawing Russian forces into built-up urban areas where their tanks were highly vulnerable and unleashing extremely effective ambushes. This was obvious during the first weeks of the invasion, where Russian tank columns rolling into Kyiv were stopped in their tracks by Ukrainian ambushes. As armor and troops poured into the country, General Colonel Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's ground forces, determined that the Russian columns would need to advance along 2 or 3 major highways to enter Kyiv in their blitzkrieg attack. So Syrsky organized 2 rings of troops to defend the city, one in the outer suburbs and one in the capital, with as much space between them as possible, in order to minimize damage to infrastructure. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv, allowing them to easily target the highways and saving them from Russian airstrikes. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv. This strategy proved to be extremely effective, allowing defenders to destroy many of the slow-moving tanks. Videos like this now famous 45-second clip released by Ukraine's defense ministry showed entire companies of Russian armor being destroyed in deadly ambushes by Ukrainian hit-and-run teams using anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs. As Russian columns rolled through built-up urban areas in long, strung out with no infantry support, they were devastated by such barrages. This was even clearer later on. For instance, during the battle for the small town of Volodar. In early 2023, Ukraine placed hundreds of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines in the fields outside the town. Due to the flat landscape and lack of cover, any Russian minesweepers were immediately targeted with artillery fire. Ukrainian troops left corridors between the mined fields, only large enough for 2 or 3 Russian tanks at a time to roll through. If the tanks moved at all from the cleared path, they risked having their treads blown off, leaving them totally exposed to artillery strikes. When Russian commanders predictably ordered their tanks to lead the assault along these unmined paths outside Volodar, it left them incredibly vulnerable to the same type of ambushes Ukrainians have deployed since the start of the invasion. Hiding in covered positions near the tank columns, Ukrainian hunter-killer teams set up anti-tank missiles on both sides of the kill zone. Without triggering the anti-tank mines, these teams were able to cross the minefields and dig themselves into strategic positions, often hiding in bushes or abandoned buildings. From there they could fire and retreat with little fear of being hit by tank fire. Much like Chechen rebels, Ukrainians also used building rooftops and windows to target the weakly armored top sections of tanks. Because Russia refused to dismount their infantry to avoid them getting shot, this left them completely unable to fight back. But unlike Chechen rebels, Ukrainian troops have also had the advantage of modern ATGMs, which they have used to incredible effect against Russian armor. These include everything from the more basic Ukrainian-manufactured Stugna P to advanced Western-produced systems like the Javelin, Next-Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon or NLAW, and AT-4. These 4 ATGMs have accounted for the majority of Russia's tank losses during the invasion, providing Ukrainians with a highly cost-effective way of handling tank columns. As a result, in just one 3-week period, Russia lost over 130 tanks and armored vehicles in Volodar, forcing Putin to rely on human wave-style infantry assaults to try and take the position. And in other battles during the war, Russia did actually dismount its infantry troops, but poor training and equipment meant that they failed to properly scan the flanks. When the ambushes began, many Russian soldiers also panicked, leading to a breakdown in the chain of command and chaotic, disorganized retreats. Infantry fled and tried to find cover wherever possible. In some places, Russian soldiers were even rolled over by their own armor. Footage from a later battle at Volodar, shared on Telegram earlier this year, showed 2 Russian soldiers being dragged under a retreating tank, and a soldier covered in flames running from a tank shortly before it exploded. Complete disasters like this are only possible with badly trained troops, as one of the earliest lessons taught in any effective infantry academy is how to react to ambushes by rallying and pushing out of the kill zone. Because Russian infantry have failed to do so, it often hasn't even mattered that they have dismounted to support the tank units. Multiply this by a year and a half of fighting, and it's easy to see why Russia is pulling antiques like the T-55 out of storage and museums, Recent satellite imagery shows that an open-air depot in remote Buryatia in eastern Siberia has lost about 40% of all tanks and armored vehicles it had previously been housing. This is Russia's largest known tank depot, suggesting that others may be even more depleted. And with every passing month, the Russian military fields increasingly less capable tanks as they cannot replace their losses. International sanctions mean they cannot obtain the advanced parts necessary to build more modern armor, such as the T-90 or T-14 Armata. It's also unclear how many tanks Russia was able to produce even before the invasion. Some Russian sources say that one of its largest tank production plants was capable of pumping out 20 a month, with others claiming slightly less. The country also has 2 new plants under construction, but even so, its production cannot compare to the staggering losses of more than 150 a month in Ukraine. And anything actually coming off the line in Russia is now certainly not modern. Sanctions mean no modern electronics for targeting or specialized kits like thermal vision. They even affect things as basic as ball bearings, which are crucial to the production of modern vehicles. Before the war, Russia received some 55% of ball bearings from Europe, Canada, and the US. These deficiencies make producing anything more advanced than a T-80 essentially impossible, seriously diminishing the future potential of Russian armor as a whole. Unable to obtain modern parts, Russia has resorted to pushing tanks off the line with only gunners' sights, reducing the range of their guns by almost 1.5 miles. That type of distance seriously matters against something like a Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams. Russian tanks will essentially have to engage in close-quarters combat, hoping that they can gain the element of surprise against superior Ukrainian firepower. Needless to say, this will result in even greater losses of armor and soldiers, creating a vicious cycle of decreased production and increased costs. Very few governments could sustain wartime production in such an environment, and Putin's government, as the last few years have shown us, is anything but effective or competent. This is especially true due to the economic strain and enormous costs imposed by the destruction of tanks and other materiel. During the first months of 2023, Russia blew through its entire defense budget for the year, and there are no indications that new sources of revenue are opening up. European price caps on Russian oil, import bans, and corruption and inefficiency in Russia's massive oil sector mean that this year it will be lucky to break even. This is a disaster for the country's wider economy, since the Russian oil and natural gas sector has historically been its most economically powerful, accounting for 20% of its pre-war GDP and 45% of its monthly budget. Adding to the economic pain is the fact that Russia is now taxing its domestic oil industry based on Brent crude prices, rather than its own energy prices, meaning energy companies in Russia are paying taxes on revenue that cannot even be generated. In the best case, this scenario will leave the country's oil market breaking even, meaning its funds cannot be used to subsidize the production of new tanks or any other military hardware. Long story short, there really is no effective path for Russia to keep its production of tanks going long-term, all while its embarrassingly bad combat doctrine and lack of modern technology ensures that steep losses on the battlefield will continue. While Ukraine has far less capability to produce its own tanks, that won't matter nearly as much if it continues to receive aid from the West. NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg recently confirmed that more than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine have already been delivered, and that means over 1,550 armored vehicles, 230 tanks and other equipment, including vast amounts of ammunition. In total, we have trained and equipped more than 9 new Ukrainian armored brigades. This will put Ukraine in a strong position to continue to retake occupied territory. Whether these are followed up by more tanks and armored infantry vehicles later this year or in 2024 likely depends on Ukraine's performance in its slowly ramping up counteroffensive, as well as continued international political support for Ukraine. There is little question that even the current supply of tanks will pose a massive challenge to Russia's ability to hold on to its occupied territory. But it is also a matter of more than just firepower. The UK Ministry of Defence recently wrote that Russia has constructed some of the most extensive systems of military defensive networks seen anywhere in the world for many decades, not just near the current front lines, but also deep inside areas Russia currently controls. Intelligence reports and satellite imagery show a particular effort to fortify the northern border of Crimea with a multi-layered defensive zone built up around the village of Medvedevka, including minefields designed to force Ukraine into a choke point. All of this indicates that Russian field commanders are at least now aware that their own losses are a serious issue, and that Ukraine's modern tanks will likely win in any head-to-head engagement. Because of this, the coming months of the war may become a standoff, with Ukraine unable to penetrate Russia's defensive positions, but Russia unable to launch another tank offensive for fear of losing its now limited supplies. In the end, as with many wars, the future of this conflict will most likely be determined by attrition. Whichever side can outlast the other will be able to gain the upper hand, especially in the critical area of tank warfare. Russia's experience so far shows that it never dealt with the long-standing issues present in its military and economy, something which has only been accelerated after a year and a half of war and sanctions. Its enormous tank losses certainly seem unsustainable, but only time will tell if they ultimately tip the balance of power in favor of Ukraine. But what do you think? Will Russian tank losses prove to be a deciding factor in the conflict, or will Russia be able to overcome its issues and keep Ukraine's counteroffensive from achieving success? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. First tanks, and now submarines. Putin can't seem to keep hold of his weapons, with Russia's only aircraft carrier catching fire not once, not twice, but 3 times since 2018, and his guided missile cruiser, the Moskva, sinking in 2022. Russia's navy, widely considered one of the most powerful in the world, has seen better days, and now Russia's submarine power is under serious threat. Here's why. It's no secret that things haven't been going well for Russia, from crushing sanctions to staggering military casualties. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has backfired in a host of unexpected ways. It has also highlighted profound weaknesses in Russia's military capabilities, exposing them as aging, corrupt, and poorly led. Nowhere is this more true than at sea. Despite statements by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev back in 2009 that, without a navy, Russia does not have a future as a state, the country's surface fleet remains embarrassingly inept. Former US Navy Admiral James G. Foggo recently noted that it has been allowed to atrophy due to factors like poor maintenance, low funding, and corruption. This trend has been on full display during recent years, with the Russian Navy suffering a number of embarrassing high-profile mishaps. Its only aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, nicknamed the unluckiest ship in the world, has caught fire at least 3 times since 2018. Earlier this year, Ukrainian intelligence assessed that the ship is in critical condition and not capable of moving under its own power. That's not to mention the sinking of Russia's Black Sea flagship, the Moskva, in April 2022. But now there's an even bigger problem for Putin, one deep below the waves. For all the issues with its surface fleet, Russia's current fleet of 58 submarines have been long considered among the most powerful in the world. This includes 11 nuclear-powered ballistic missile subs, 17 nuclear-powered attack subs, and 9 nuclear-powered cruise missile subs, with several more on the way next year. While they haven't been a factor in Ukraine, they are still considered a critical threat by the US military. However, their power may not last forever. Recent reports suggest that Russia's submarine capabilities are being seriously harmed by the backlash to its invasion, especially through the crippling effect of Western sanctions. So what does that mean for the future of the Russian military? And just how serious of a blow could it be to Putin's war machine? To understand just how critical Putin's submarine problem could be, we first need to take a quick look at some Russian naval history, which, funnily enough, is permeated with continuing and humiliating losses of fleets. But wait, there's a plot twist, and it occurs just after World War II. Russia has had military power at sea in one form or another since 1696, when Peter the Great first established the Imperial Russian Navy. Impressed by his visits to Western Europe, Peter realized that Russia could never be a true great power while remaining landlocked. By 1710, he had over 58 ships in his fleet, and despite some defeats, by Peter's death in 1725, Russia was the dominant sea power in the Baltic. During the reign of Catherine the Great, the empire's ambitions at sea had grown, establishing a new Black Sea fleet and annexing Crimea for the first time in 1783. By the time of her death in 1796, Russia possessed the world's largest navy after Britain. This period was the height of Russia's imperial naval power. As naval historian Robert A. Theobald once put it, "To my mind, the death of Catherine marks the high watermark in Russian naval history." From this date to the end of the Imperial Navy, it was on a treadmill working hard but getting nowhere. This became obvious during the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, where Russia suffered a stinging defeat to the combined forces of the Ottomans, France, and Britain. The shortcomings of the Imperial Navy were even more obvious by the time of the 1904–1905 Russo-Japanese War. But it gets worse. In response to Russian expansionism in the Far East, the newly industrialized Japanese military gave Russian Tsar Nicholas II a humiliating defeat at sea. The war marked Japan's emergence as a great power and contributed heavily to the First Russian Revolution of 1905. Following the Second Revolution in 1917, what remained of the old Imperial Navy came under control of the Soviet Union. And while Lenin and Stalin both aimed to rebuild a powerful Soviet Navy, it remained largely inept throughout both world wars and into the early 1950s. As Theobald described it in his well-known 1953 presentation at the US Naval War College, this is the history of a navy which has lost more complete fleets than any other navy in the world. It is the history of a navy which has never been more than second-rate, that has never been decisive in world history, and that has never developed a depth of tradition to compare with those of the Western navies. But this would change drastically only a few years after his assessment, mainly due to one factor: modern submarines. While Russia had some early submarines before World War II, the first modern Soviet ballistic missile submarines were completed in the late 1950s. These early Soviet models were diesel-electric and based on designs pioneered by the Germans, similar to the United States. However, by 1960, the Soviet Navy had launched its first nuclear-powered attack submarines, giving the USSR below-surface capabilities greater than perhaps any country except the US. Soon after, the Soviets also developed nuclear SSGN-class subs, running on nuclear power but designed to launch limited ballistic missile strikes against American aircraft carriers and other naval deployments. Over the next 3 decades, the Soviet Navy continued to build and maintain a large fleet of submarines, relying on them heavily to challenge America's greater military strength during the Cold War. Because the true names of Soviet subs were rarely known abroad, most are still referred to by NATO codenames, such as the Alpha-class nuclear subs. These use liquid metal-cooled reactor propulsion systems and titanium hulls, enabling them to move extremely fast, over 43 knots or 80 kilometers an hour, at an operational depth of 2,000 feet or 600 meters. Also important to Soviet deterrence and power projection were the Typhoon-class subs. The largest submarines ever built, Typhoons are over 563 feet or 172 meters long, have a beam of 81 feet or 25 meters, and can carry up to 20 Sturgeon nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. These were just a few of the many varieties of subs developed by the Soviet Navy, and the Soviets also continued heavily building diesel-electric models as well, such as the Kilo-class attack subs and others. The fleet was never able to make the switch to fully nuclear-powered, largely due to budgetary and technological constraints. However, by its peak in 1980, the USSR's submarine force had 480 boats, including 71 fast attack and 94 cruise and ballistic missile submarines. Even following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, this submarine fleet remained a major part of Russia's naval power. Dmitry Gorenberg of the Center for Naval Analyses has noted that during the post-Cold War period, Putin has focused on developing new submarine capabilities, while Russia has essentially lost the ability to construct new, advanced surface vessels. The most advanced of these submarine developments are the Yasen and updated Yasen M-class SSGNs. Developed in the 1990s and early 2000s, Rand Corporation researcher Edward Geist has described these as the crown jewel of the contemporary Russian Navy, and perhaps the pinnacle of present-day Russian military technology. And according to Admiral Foggo, one major advantage of the Yasen-class vessels is that they are very quiet, which is the most important thing in submarine warfare. They can also carry both Zircon hypersonic and long-range Caliber cruise missiles. Yet these deadly subs also come with a hefty price tag. The Severodvinsk, the first Yasen-class model, reportedly cost over $1.6 billion. While this is still much cheaper than the US's most advanced subs, it is a very high price tag considering Russia's far smaller economy. In the past few years, Putin's government has also claimed that even more nuclear subs are in the works. including what Russian state media claim to be a new division of submarines carrying nuclear-capable super torpedoes in the coming years. Nick Childs, Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, has argued that investments in submarines up to this point are one of the only things which has allowed Russia to maintain its status among the leading powers. While its fleet is still far smaller than during the Soviet era, Childs points out that it remains very capable, and along with some of the older submarines, would still pose a threat to NATO, both at sea and against land-based targets. But even before the war in Ukraine, there were some doubts about the true effectiveness of Russia's impressive-seeming subs. While they are doubtless in better shape than its surface fleet, they have never been truly tested in combat. So how are Putin's submarine fleets faring in the Russo-Ukraine conflict? On land, the reckless nature of Russian military doctrine has been on full display in the invasion of Ukraine. But despite the enormous losses by Russia's ground forces, its navy has so far played a very limited role in the conflict. This includes its submarines, which have remained mostly as a nuclear deterrent and threat. The exception to this is Russia's Black Sea Fleet, where submarines off the coast of Sevastopol and Novorossiysk have been used to fire Caliber missiles into Ukraine. None of these subs have so far been damaged or destroyed, and there are still concerns that they could be used to counter NATO activity and control trade routes in the Black Sea. But the consequences of Putin's invasion have created a different kind of problem for the Russian Navy and its submarines. The crushing regime of Western sanctions imposed on Russia has begun to erode the country's ability to resupply and maintain its military industry. And in December of 2022, the US State Department added even more sanctions directly targeting Russia's naval power. These have already begun to work, cutting Russia off from the technology required in modern subs. As Admiral Foggo told Newsweek in an interview, "I think they have been severely crippled by these economic sanctions and by their own foolishness in the war in Ukraine. In particular, the maintenance of existing subs and development of new ones will become increasingly difficult since, when they don't have the raw materials, they can't sustain the industrial base. They don't have the manpower, because that manpower is going into fighting the war in Ukraine." Military losses and brain drain make it likely that Russia will lose its ability to compete with Western countries in submarine development, especially when it comes to their ability to project power. Graham P. Hurd of the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies argues that the protracted nature of the conflict and the coming Ukrainian counter-offensive undercuts Russian military credibility. The repeated military failures in Ukraine have created growing pressure in Russia to project an image of strength through its submarines. In turn, this has incentivized the Russian Navy to take greater risks by using submarines which are not seaworthy and fast-tracking new weapon systems without proper testing. Hurd added that submarines are the most expensive ticket item in Russia's military budget and have no obvious utility in this war. So Russia compensates and projects power through acceptance of greater risk. As a consequence, Russia's submarines will suffer indirect and long-term damage the longer the war lasts. Similarly, Hurd and other experts have pointed out that the sanctions illustrate just how much of Russia's military-industrial complex was, and remains, reliant on critical Western technology. Without the advanced components for submarines manufactured in the US, UK, France, Germany, and elsewhere, Russian development will be seriously stunted in the years to come. And there are almost no alternatives to the technology which sanctions have cut Russia off from. Parts from China and Iran, for example, are not advanced enough to meet Moscow's requirements. While experts remain divided on just how dependent Russia's nuclear submarines are on Western tech, it's pretty clear that at least some of the imported components are necessary to build new vessels. These are mostly thought to be technologically advanced electronic components for guidance, communication, and missile deployment. Russian defense journalist Alexander Timokhin wrote in January that the sanctions imposed on Russia after the special military operation left a sharp imprint on the country's technological capabilities. The production of radar complexes, communication systems, guided missiles, sonar equipment, and other similar systems has proved to be difficult. As a consequence, these restrictions could make it nearly impossible to build Yasen and Yasen M-class subs and other highly capable boats. Childs from the International Institute for Strategic Studies points out that this trajectory is already visible, as while the newest Russian submarines are very capable, Russia's inefficient shipbuilding industry has struggled to deliver them on time and in significant numbers. Like other experts, he agrees that Russia's construction shortfalls will accelerate in the coming months and years, since this could well be exacerbated by the increased demands on other sectors of the defense industry as a result of the war, as well as from the impact of sanctions on certain key components. So what do these deficiencies mean for Putin's ambitions and the future of the Russian military? Well, experts have outlined two main possible scenarios for the future of Russia's submarine fleet. One possibility is that as military resource constraints continue to grow, it will lead to prioritization of the elements which have been most impacted, especially ground forces. As of May 2023, Russia has lost nearly 200,000 soldiers, a truly staggering figure for a modern military. In turn, as one analyst put it, that will inevitably lead to cuts, or limits at least, in shipbuilding in the future. The other possibility is that Russia will be forced to funnel more investment into submarines due to their relative importance and strategic value. This will mean less and less resources for replenishing ground troops and equipment, which are both cheaper and more expendable. But even if Putin opts for the second scenario, any money spent now is likely to have a delayed impact. Past investments in submarine development and maintenance will carry the Russian fleet for at least a few more years to come, but within 5 to 10 years, it could be a very different picture. Just based on the size and current capabilities of Russian submarines, it will likely remain one of the world's most powerful fleets for the next decade. But after that, things are far more uncertain. Any modern submarine which breaks down in the years could become essentially useless, reduced to just so much expensive scrap metal. However Putin attempts to manage his growing economic constraints, the main role of Russian submarines will probably remain as a nuclear deterrent. And there are also some indications that Putin has already realized just how spread thin his resources really are. In March, Russia's Pacific Fleet underwent a series of military drills which were described as a surprise inspection of more than a dozen submarines, potentially signaling a lack of faith by the Kremlin in the readiness or maintenance of the fleet. Readouts from the Kremlin show that Putin recently told Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu that while Russia's priorities remain the war in Ukraine, still, the objective to develop the Navy, including in the Pacific Theater of Operations, remains relevant. Adding that, it is clear that some of the fleet's assets can be used in conflicts elsewhere. This indicates both that Putin does not believe submarines can make much of a difference in Ukraine, and that they remain most useful as a nuclear deterrent. As Russia's submarines begin to break down in the coming years, with no easy way to maintain them or build new state-of-the-art models, the country will also become less able to project power in this way. This will almost certainly happen, regardless of where the Kremlin prioritizes resources, especially since casualties in Ukraine show no sign of slowing down. As losses climb higher and higher, and as sanctions continue their squeeze, it may also provoke Putin into even more aggressive and reckless strategies. In fact, there is evidence that this is already taking place. In the past few months, Russia has deployed submarines in increasingly threatening positions. As Michael Peterson, the director of the Russia Maritime Studies Institute, told Newsweek, "We have indications that nuclear-powered submarines have been deploying off the coast of the United States and into the Mediterranean and elsewhere along Europe periphery, in ways that mirror Soviet-style submarine deployments in the Cold War." Such aggressive posturing is likely tied to Putin's growing issues in an attempt to project a facade of Russia as a true global power, despite an economy less than half the size of California. This weakness is also reflected in overly optimistic predictions for its military-industrial complex. A recent analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, concluded, similarly to other experts, that Russian officials continue to claim that Russian defense manufacturers are increasing production amidst ongoing indications that the Russian Defense Industrial Base (DIB) is unable to meet Russia's long-term economic and military goals. There have been rosy claims by officials like Alexei Rachmanov, head of the Russian United Shipbuilding Company, that submarine production time will soon be cut by 8 to 13 months. But there is little evidence to support this, and in another sign of growing weakness, Putin signed a decree on February the 27th, reducing previous plans to construct at least 3 nuclear reactor-equipped Leiter-class icebreakers by 2035 down to just a single vessel. Again, this likely reflects the fact that the need to replenish the stocks of conventional ground weaponry lost in Ukraine will likely consume the majority of Russia's DIB and limit Russia's ability to produce systems aimed at longer-term strategic goals. This includes both nuclear icebreakers and submarines, indicating that Russia's resources are spread much thinner than Putin would like the world to believe. So, to sum up, despite the claims by the Kremlin, there are strong signs that Russia's disastrous strategy in Ukraine has backfired even more than we know. The squeeze of Western sanctions now threatens to render even the deadly Russian submarine fleet obsolete. The longer the war goes on and the more isolated Russia becomes, the harder it will be to obtain the advanced components needed for these vessels. This will continue to erode the country's industrial base, possibly crippling all long-term defense production. And because Russian losses in Ukraine are so heavy, Putin also faces a crisis of credibility and growing pressure to project a facade of power. This has already led to reckless, aggressive posturing by Russian subs and a willingness to use vessels which are not even seaworthy, a problem which seems likely to increase. Because the Russian Navy has historically been so reliant on them to project power, there is little question that the stagnation of its submarine fleet will be a serious blow in the coming years. But what do you think? Will sanctions and battlefield losses eventually doom Russia's submarine fleet? Or can Putin find a way around these issues and keep Russia as a great power? Let us know what you think in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.
When you're trying to conquer one of the largest areas in Eastern Europe, a little over 233,000 square miles to be exact, which is roughly the size of Texas, and you're running low on tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, aerial drones, and trained military personnel, you can be pretty sure you're failing miserably. Add an increasingly evaporating number of military aircraft to the equation, and it's time to hit the panic button. Be it land or sky, Putin just can't seem to hold on to his weapons, and it's not just embarrassing. It's downright self-destructive. In the case of aerial warfare, it is disastrous. For Russia, of course. Here's the thing. Air power should have been Putin's biggest advantage in Ukraine. When Putin's invasion began in February of 2022, experts and analysts were seriously gloomy about the smaller country's ability to defend its airspace. Most assumed that Russia's much-vaunted air force, the VKS, would be able to quickly overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses and gain a decisive early advantage in the conflict. Even the most optimistic assessments assumed that Russia's air campaign would destroy Ukrainian jets on their bases, while using large-scale ballistic and cruise missile strikes to blind the country's surface-to-air missile radars. This would have forced Ukraine to move its SAM systems away from the front lines, leaving it at a severe early disadvantage and increasingly vulnerable to Russian sorties. But these predictions, often from top conflict analysts, proved to be completely wrong. In more than a year of war, Russia has utterly failed to establish air superiority, while managing to lose staggering quantities of its jets and other assets. In fact, the situation is so bad that earlier this month, one pro-Russian blogger on Telegram, usually cheerleaders for the invasion, stated that the country's air force has engaged in complete idiocy and is detached from reality. Definitely not a good look for Putin. So how has this colossal embarrassment happened? As usual, there's no single answer here. But like other aspects of Russia's failure in Ukraine, it has a lot to do with the long-term issues plaguing the country's military: corruption, bad strategies, poor training, and more. These certainly aren't new issues, but the war in Ukraine has exposed how much they've come to affect Russian capabilities. To get a better picture of how this has happened, let's start with a super quick look back at both fighter jets and air defense systems from the starting point of the most exciting eras in aircraft development: the Jet Age. The so-called Jet Age kicked off in the late 1940s, spurred by profound changes in the field of aeronautics. The jets developed during this period could fly faster, higher, and farther than older piston-powered aircraft. This would soon come to transform the aviation industry in both its commercial and military forms. By using the technology of jet propulsion, many pilots believed they could outrun their enemies in the skies and theoretically create total air superiority. Using jet propulsion, aircraft could vastly increase their speed, a major reason why aircraft-mounted guns were mostly replaced by missiles. By far the most reliable way to shoot a supersonic jet out of the sky. Still the go-to weapon for aerial combat today, aerial missiles also revolutionized the nature of air defenses. Today they rely almost entirely on surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, to prevent hostile attacks from the sky. And from the 1970s onwards, It also became possible for infantry troops to take down aircraft with their own portable handheld anti-aircraft missiles. These man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, are highly cost-effective shoulder-fired rockets able to lock onto aircraft using infrared homing. They are also easy to use, able to be taught to new recruits in a matter of minutes or hours. And since the start of last year, Ukrainians have shown the world just how valuable MANPADS can be. As Putin's invasion began, Western nations assumed the Russian Air Force would be among the most significant challenges for Ukrainian defenders. When Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov visited Washington in November 2021 to press for weapons, he reportedly told American officials, "We have to prepare now. Point number one is air defense." So NATO members sent thousands of MANPADS into Ukraine to shore up the country's surface-to-air capabilities. Among others, these weapon transfers have included American-made Stingers, high-velocity British Starstreak missiles, and even surplus Soviet EGLOS systems. And this decision really paid off. These comparatively cheap air defenses managed to stop Russia from obtaining air superiority by imposing asymmetrical costs on any Russian pilot dumb enough to enter Ukrainian airspace. For example, using one 60,000 to 80,000 EGLOS missile, Ukrainian soldiers have been able to down a $36 million Su-34 bomber or an $85 million Sukhoi Su-35S fighter jet. This huge cost differential has had effects across the battlespace in Ukraine. Because modern combined arms warfare is highly dependent on air support, Russia's failure to dominate the skies has had serious repercussions. The inability to provide sufficient air cover for its tanks, infantry, artillery, or supply lines is one of the reasons Russian forces have taken such devastating losses. Caught in the open, these troops have been falling prey to a range of Ukrainian ambushes from hidden positions on the ground. But does the failure by Russia to achieve air superiority mean a lack of Russian aircraft? Kind of, but not exactly. Ukrainian troops near the front lines around Bakhmut have told reporters that Russia continues to fly daily sorties in hopes of catching their targets unaware. Most of these flyovers last only moments. Russian fighter jets or bombers, often flying in groups of 4, fly at low altitude over a target area before quickly dropping or firing their payloads and hightailing it back to their bases. Less maneuverable attack helicopters will also fly right up to the line of combat before firing their missile salvos and quickly fleeing to safety. Another reason for this is the recent addition of the powerful Slovakian S-300 missile defense system to Ukraine's arsenal. This longer-range surface-to-air missile can target Russian jets at higher altitudes, forcing them to fly lower to screen themselves from attack. And in turn, the lower altitude flights have made them extremely vulnerable to shoulder-mounted missile systems. Because of the medium-range S-300s and shorter-range threat posed by Ukrainian MANPADS, no Russian air assets are able to spend extended periods of time near the front. Despite the obvious difficulty of shooting down even a low-flying aircraft, the Ukrainian strategy seems to be working pretty well. One report from mid-May 2023 suggested that Ukraine had downed 4 aircraft in a single day of fighting. While Ukrainian commanders would not confirm their role in the attack, the country's defense ministry stated that the Russian craft ran into some trouble. Numbers like this highlight the focused and effective use of MANPADS, with soldiers using constant vigilance around the clock to exploit the tiny 3 to 5 second firing window. Ukraine's surprising ability to contest its airspace was also partly what allowed it to go on the offensive late last year. Some of this was done with Turkish-made Bayraktar drones, which were used to destroy high-value targets like Russian surface-to-air missiles. This strategy, one that Russia has failed in executing itself, allowed Ukraine to launch more attacks from the air without fear of being shot down. Ukraine also used what limited air power it had in some very creative ways. During the sinking of the Russian Black Sea flagship, the Moskva, Ukraine used a drone to distract the ship's anti-air capabilities before launching a salvo of Neptune anti-ship missiles before the unlucky crew could react. Other tactics have included dispersing aircraft and air defense units out of major airfields, vacating certain air defense positions before they could take any losses from Russian fire, and operating their air defense SAM batteries as pop-up units, rather than large batteries with support vehicles. This final tactic proved to be extremely valuable, stopping Russian forces from effectively targeting most of Ukraine's air defenses. While we now take for granted that Ukrainian soldiers will find creative and deadly ways to use its lesser capabilities, it is still no small feat. In fact, the creative use of air power highlights that Ukraine may now have a better understanding of air operations than even many NATO countries. David A. Deptula, a retired U.S. Air Force lieutenant general, has argued that the West can actually learn from Ukraine here. "We've become so dominant in the air that we've never had to think through how we would use air power if we were the inferior force," he said. "Ukraine is posing us some very interesting questions that we should seriously consider, if only to understand how a clever opponent would take us on." Russia, on the other hand, has continually failed to learn from their abysmal performance in the skies. And as with so much else, Russia's systemic failure to establish air superiority also points to the larger issues within the country's military. This became noticeable early on in Ukraine, when rather than overwhelming force, only 1 or 2 aircraft at a time conducted strikes against targets in and around Ukrainian cities close to the borders, including Kyiv, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, and Mariupol. And when pilots missed their targets, they very rarely mounted follow-up strikes. At that same time, Russian military planners apparently made no plans for large-scale bombardments of air defenses themselves. In fact, they have seemed entirely unable to coordinate the large, complex formations necessary for fighter jets and helicopters to cover each other from enemy fire. More than almost anything else, this helps explain Russia's baffling inability to establish control over the skies, despite its qualitative and quantitative advantages. Western air forces have long taken for granted the ability to coordinate the timing and positioning of their attacks in campaigns like the Balkans, Iraq, or Libya. However, the level of planning, logistical, and command and control capacity needed for such air campaigns is massive. Every pilot needs to coordinate and understand their role in the broader operation, including the exact timing and route needed to strike multiple targets. Tanker support is also critical to ensure refueling can take place at established rendezvous points. The complexity only increases once actual combat begins, as various fighters tasked with destroying air defenses, those engaging enemy aircraft, bombers, electronic warfare escorts, and search and rescue teams must all work seamlessly together and adapt at a moment's notice. Russia has failed on basically all of these fronts. Many Russian pilots are trained to fly exclusively in pairs or fours, with little exposure to larger maneuvers or formations. They also get far fewer flying hours than NATO crews, do not have tanker support for most operations, and are not trained in large-scale aerial combat doctrine. Lacking all these elements, it's no wonder that Russia could not carry out a Western-style air war against Ukraine. And even in the instances where the Russian Air Force scored victories against Ukrainian positions, they were unable to capitalize on those strikes due to fear of manpads and larger surface-to-air missile systems. When Russia refocused its troops in the Donbas region during April of 2022, they were able to gain some localized air superiority near the new front lines, mainly through the use of artillery strikes against Ukrainian SAMs. But even when they were actually able to gain this limited control of the skies, Russia utterly failed to turn it into any type of concrete battlefield advantage. As one analyst from the London-based Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, put it, the primary reason for this is that despite having more than 300 modern fast jets with theoretically flexible capabilities to carry a range of air-to-air and air-to-ground munitions, most Russian aircrew have very limited opportunities to drop precision-guided munitions in realistic training scenarios. Another major factor is actually hitting their targets, as many of Russia's jets do not have targeting pods, a standard feature on most Western military aircraft. In fact, while Russia's Su-34 fleet of jets have forward targeting systems and can use precision-guided munitions, they're just about the only ones. The rest of Russia's fighter jets have very limited capability to identify and destroy any battlefield targets which do not show up on radar. This means they've pretty much been limited to attacking fixed targets with satellite or TV-guided weapons, or dropping unguided bombs and rockets at predetermined coordinates. One observer noted they are literally cratering empty fields, while an anonymous official from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency told reporters early this year that under half of all Russian missiles are hitting their aim point. We're holding Russian missile success at just below 40%. In Donbas, this incredibly poor performance has meant Russian jets cannot effectively support ground operations, leaving troops open to a range of ambushes and other tactics. But how did the Russian Air Force end up in such a sad state, especially when Putin ordered a modernization of the fleet just a decade ago? The answer, as with so many things in Russia, seems to be a product of the country's structural issues. While the modernization was supposedly intended to make modern combined force operations easier, it appears to have been mostly for show. One part of this has been inefficiency and widespread corruption. For example, in 2012, one Russian arms company received nearly $26 million to develop an aircraft system for intercepting non-strategic missiles. But the research never actually happened. The company signed the fraudulent contracts with shell companies, the addresses of which were registered to the addresses of public toilets in the Russian city of Samara. In another case from 2016, one company responsible for supplying radio navigation equipment and control systems for guided munitions had a similar scandal. Its top leadership were caught in an embezzlement scheme where they faked research and development techniques in order to steal millions through fraudulent contracts. This type of corruption is common and widespread, also reaching beyond Russia's military-industrial complex and into the top levels of its political elite. So much personal wealth is on the line that some experts argue it has completely changed the incentive structure for Putin's top officials. Most of these individuals own property far beyond their official levels of income, signaling a range of corrupt deals. In turn, these security officials have less incentive to give actual expert advice, which could disappoint Putin and lose them access to their sweet kickbacks. And as mentioned before, poor training and an inflexible command structure compounds these issues. As Phillips O'Brien, professor of strategic studies at University of St. Andrews, has written, though much was made of the flashy new equipment, such as the much-hyped Su-34 strike aircraft, the Russian Air Force continues to suffer from flawed logistics operations and the lack of regular, realistic training. Above all, the autocratic Russian kleptocracy does not trust low-ranking and middle-ranking officers, and so cannot allow the imaginative, flexible decision-making that NATO air forces rely upon. So when Russian pilots actually have a chance to act flexibly and change their attacks to hit something, bad commanders and rigid doctrine do not allow them to improvise. Instead, they have to try to pull off their standing orders, even if those are likely to fail or lead to their untimely demise from Ukrainian air defenses. It really doesn't look like the situation will get better for the Russian Air Force either. The VKS has shown no sign of changing tactics and seems very hesitant to even use its best jets in the field. This might be because Western sanctions have hit the Russian aerospace industry particularly hard, quickly eroding Russia's ability to obtain the components needed to produce new advanced fighter jets. This became evident in a January call where Putin publicly attacked Denis Manturov, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Trade and Industry. Previously a favorite of Putin, Manturov was humiliated when he explained that the country was unable to obtain the contracts needed for new parts. One Moscow-based defense analyst even told reporters that you have to ask yourself if Manturov is going to be the next one of Putin's cronies you read about mysteriously falling out of a window somewhere. But the corruption, sanctions, and mounting losses of aircraft in Ukraine seem to have made actually getting the parts an impossible task. This is pretty obvious when we take a look at Russia's 3 production facilities for Sukhoi aircraft. Despite their massive size, analysis from last year shows that they only produced 31 aircraft during 2022, falling far short of the orders placed in state defense contracts. Essentially, as Rand Corporation analyst John V. Paracchini recently put it, Russia's aerospace sector isn't likely to have aircraft to sell, even if it wants to. At the end of March 2023, Ukraine's Armed Forces General Staff claimed at least 305 aircraft had been destroyed since the start of the war. While Russia has reportedly even resorted to stripping the microchips from household appliances to replace its losses, it isn't nearly enough. One Ukrainian defense executive stated that production for some of the most critical subsystems for Russian fighters has almost seized up. Problematic items like the Su-35's Irbis passive electronically scanning array radar antenna can require a year or more, and that is in times of no embargoes, no supply disruptions. These problems are even greater for Russia's fleet of bombers, such as the Tupolev Tu-95 and Tu-22M3. While Russia has maintained some domestic production capacity for its fighter jets over the years, mainly due to demand from abroad, this isn't the case for bombers. Once the current fleet begins to break down, there is literally no way for Russia to replace them. This is one of the main reasons why many analysts and experts now call Russia's equipment losses in this area irreversible, with no chance of restoring stockpiles to pre-war levels. The situation for Russia's Air Force is also likely to get worse once Ukraine begins receiving the Western F-16s. Retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Dan Hampton stated in a recent interview that compared to an F-16, the Russian Su-35 is essentially junk, adding that our planes are more durable. I wouldn't bet in combat on the Su-35 or any Russian-made aircraft. F-16s are versatile multi-role combat aircraft, which come in 1- and 2-seater models. Since 1979, the F-16 has been continuously upgraded, giving the newer models advanced radar and other capabilities. With a top speed of 1,500 miles per hour, a 33-foot wingspan, and 50-foot length, Hampton points out that the F-16 is very hard to see because it's smaller than most aircraft, especially when it's aimed directly at you. Each also has one M61A1 20mm multi-barrel cannon and can carry 6 air-to-air missiles. While this payload can pack a serious punch, the Russian planes should also be deadly if used correctly. The Su-35 is a twin-engine, single-seat fighter jet, which the RAND Corporation has called Russia's signature heavy fighter bomber. While the Su-35 is reportedly faster than the F-16, able to reach Mach 2, it does not have the same powerful active electronically scanned array radar, making it a more vulnerable and obvious target. Colonel Hampton has pointed out that the Su-35 is easy to use, easy to pick up on radar, and easy to shoot at with a long-range missile. Part of this is because it's such a large plane, with a 50-foot wingspan and a length of nearly 70 feet. And as Hampton stated, the Su-35 is a typical Russian machine and looks good, but deep down it's not really that good of a plane. But which jet is actually superior? Well, it really might come down to who is using it. As David Jordan, co-director of the Freeman Air and Space Institute at King's College London, pointed out, that on paper, it can be argued that the Su-35 has an edge over the sorts of F-16s the Ukrainians are likely to get, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Like anything else, the effectiveness of each jet will depend largely on its pilot, their training, and the tactics they employ. Seeing as Ukrainians have already held their own so effectively, there is reason to believe this won't change soon. Combined with their use of manpads, Jordan has argued that I would suspect that the F-16s in Ukrainian hands will represent a formidable challenge. Other experts suggest that the context in which a battle occurs will determine how well the F-16s stack up to the Su-35. Retired British Royal Air Force Commodore Andrew Curtis told Newsweek that if it comes to dogfighting, the F-16 is still one of the best in the world. However, the Russian pilots are likely to try and fight a standoff battle using medium and long-range missiles. If they can do this successfully, that may tilt the balance in the Su-35's favor. But regardless, it seems unlikely that Russia will be able to achieve more than the brief localized air superiority it held last year. Since Ukraine's capabilities are only growing, with more and more Western support, there is little chance of Russia making any real gains. With Russia hemmed in by manpads and other surface-to-air systems and unable to replace or make more of their advanced jets, it seems only a matter of time before Ukraine starts to retake the airspace in its east. So, to sum things up, it has truly been a terrible year for the VKS. The war in Ukraine has exposed its fundamental weaknesses, while sanctions and enormous losses have seriously harmed its future outlook. Unable to even use the advanced jets it currently has correctly, Russia's air force is not likely to see any improvement soon. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been able to adapt and use superior tactics to overcome its numerical weaknesses. Once the Ukrainian Air Force gets its hands on some F-16s, the tide of war may turn even faster. But what do you think? Why has Russia's Air Force been failing so badly? And will Ukraine continue to hold its own in the skies? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content.
As of June 2023, Russian tank losses have exceeded a whopping 4,000 since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. That is a lot of tanks, and Putin's troubles don't end there. Russia will have a manpower shortage very soon unless Putin orders another wave of mobilization. But Ukrainian losses have not been insignificant either. So far, Ukraine has managed to constantly mobilize their soldiers and replace their losses. But how long before they start running out of manpower too? Will Putin run out of troops before Ukraine does? Let's hear what our military experts have to say. In February 2023, word got out that a treasure trove of classified US documents had been leaked across the popular social media platform Discord. In those documents were some harsh assessments of the future of Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia, who had begun their full-fledged invasion a year earlier in February 2022. The more than 100 documents included secret and top-secret files on foreign intelligence, analysis of opponent forces, and briefing documents for US military and government officials. One file in particular stood out. In its pages, the source claimed that Ukraine would be faced with significant force generation and sustainment shortfalls, and the probability that any Ukrainian offensive in 2023 would result in only modest territorial gains if not supported by a sufficient number of troops and hardware. This report was not the first time Ukraine was challenged on whether they had enough men to defeat the vastly larger country of Russia. It's been evident for some time that both Ukraine and Russia have seen a decline in their populations. For Ukraine, the 2014 invasion of the Donbas region and Crimea initiated their population decline. Their population loss has significantly increased since the February 2022 invasion, coupled with the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas and brutalization of any population that didn't evacuate. Russia, despite having a vastly bigger population, has a vastly different problem. It's huge, aka hugely embarrassing losses of hardware. Russia's hardware problems in comparison to its troop losses are perhaps a more reliable indicator of just how bad the war has been going for them, since tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, trucks, and artillery are big and bulky. Their losses are harder to hide and can be counted and identified more easily than individual soldiers. When analysts look at hardware losses Russia has suffered, the numbers are simply staggering. An analysis done by the Ukrainian General Staff reports that Russian armed forces have lost over 3,900 tanks, 7,600 armored fighting vehicles, 6,400 unarmored vehicles and fuel tanks, 3,700 artillery systems, 600 multiple rocket launch systems (MLRS), 350 air defense systems, more than 300 planes, 300 helicopters, 3,200 drones, and 18 ships. To put this all into perspective, Russia was believed to have only around 3,500 main battle tanks before the invasion. The best estimates were that they invaded Ukraine with a total ground force of around 150,000 soldiers. An update on June 21, 2023 from the same Ukrainian source suggested that the number of lost Russian tanks has just exceeded 4,000. While the estimate from Ukraine might be biased, those from neutral open source group Oryx are not. They count only those weapon systems for which they can prove beyond a shadow of doubt that they were destroyed or captured, and document each and every loss in their figures. They report as of June 13, 2023, Russia has lost at a minimum 2,070 tanks, 894 armored fighting vehicles, 2,454 infantry fighting vehicles, 318 armored personnel carriers, and thousands more mine-resistant vehicles, transports, mobile artillery, air defense systems, and various intelligence, supply, and command vehicles. Since Oryx only includes confirmed losses, even they admit Russia's real losses are much higher. There are several indications of how bad Russian material losses are. One of the most glaring is that Russia has been transporting 70- and 80-year-old tanks from storage yards and even museums and sending them by rail to the front. One such relic was a T-54-55 that was packed with around 6 tons of explosives and sent trundling to the Ukrainian front lines, though it was blown up before it could reach them. That tank was built a few years after the end of World War II. Others just like it have been photographed heading towards the front lines from all over Russia. Another surprising display occurred during the 2023 May Day parade through Red Square in Moscow. Normally, this was the yearly event when the supposedly mighty Russian military would parade its newest and most powerful military vehicles, from tanks, IFVs, and multiple launch rocket systems to portable ballistic missiles, all of them overflown by frontline fighters and strategic bombers. But this year, the world received a surprise, when only a single World War II-era T-34 tank trundled through the parade. President Vladimir Putin was mocked around the world for such a weak display of supposed Russian military might. So it's pretty clear at this point that Russia is indeed running out of tanks, but does it have enough troops to defend its own cities? Even more embarrassing for Putin was the abortive March for Justice that his one-time chef and military oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin launched for a brief 24-hour period from June 23rd through 24th. Prigozhin's private military company, the Wagner Group, was able to capture the major city of Rostov-on-Don without firing a shot, and weren't met with any substantial ground opposition until they were within 125 miles of Moscow itself. The only thing that apparently stopped Prigozhin and Wagner was the failure of a popular uprising to join him. He certainly wasn't stopped by any military units. Most analysts believe that's because the vast majority of Russian military strength is all in Ukraine. Additional shortages of men and material have been seen in the Russian Oblast of Belgorod, where a series of cross-border raids launched by Free Russian opposition units, together with a small number of Polish expatriates fighting for Ukraine, have caused havoc for weeks. The minimal border security forces there have been wholly incapable of stopping them, not until they were supported by heavy artillery and air force strikes. Some reports say that the Russian defense units didn't even have weapons or ammo, since according to Russian law it was illegal for them to carry firearms. What about the regular troops? Now that we've seen that Russia has suffered a probably massive loss in hardware and material, and doesn't even have enough troops to protect its own borders, we can better understand the level of their actual troop losses and possible remaining strength. According to the same Ukrainian General Staff report mentioned earlier, Russia has lost a staggering 213,000 killed, wounded and missing soldiers, sailors and airmen. That analysis includes more than 43,000 killed in action and over 170,000 wounded, many of whom will not be returning to combat. The Independent Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, has come up with an even higher estimate. Their report from February 2023 indicated that Russia had lost as many as 250,000 total casualties. In comparison, this total from just the 12 months of fighting is more than all the combat losses Russia and the former Soviet Union had suffered in all their wars since World War II combined. The estimate of 250,000 casualties would have increased by an additional 60,000 to 70,000 casualties between February and June of 2023. In just the first 3 months of the invasion, Russia suffered as many casualties as it did during its entire 10-year war in Afghanistan. What's worse is that according to the most recent reports, their casualty rate may be increasing. Russia lost over 1,100 troops in a single day on June 8th, as Ukraine has begun to hammer Russian forces with its summer offensive. But what's causing such high casualty rates? One of the biggest causes of such casualties is the outdated method in which Russia is conducting the war. Overall, the Russian military doctrine has changed little since World War I. They rely on masses of inaccurate artillery supported by fighters that perform ground attack roles and masses of human assaults, sometimes but not always, backed up by tanks. But the Russian Air Force, known as the SVS, has seen high losses as well, due to the large numbers of surface-to-air missiles sent by the US and NATO members. They've been reluctant to fly over Ukrainian territory and prefer to lob bombs from the safety of Russian-occupied territory. Russian doctrine also suggests that if the first human assault fails, keep sending in more troops until the defenders fold. Britain's Defense Intelligence Agency points out that such outdated tactics carry with them enormous losses. Their report states that a combination of poor low-level tactics, limited air cover, a lack of flexibility and a command approach which is prepared to reinforce failure and repeat mistakes has led to Russia's high casualty rate among its troops in Ukraine. But here's the really bad part. These casualties primarily include the vets and the elite. Indeed, one of the most significant areas where Russia's casualties have had a telling effect has been in their elite units. An example of the losses such elite units have suffered can be seen in the current state of the 331st Guards Airborne Regiment, a part of the 98th Guards Airborne Division, one of the best trained and most experienced combat units Russia has available. Prior to the invasion, the 331st Regiment's size was around 1,500 to 1,700 soldiers. It sent 2 battalion groups into Ukraine at the start of the invasion on February 24, 2022, for a total of 1,000 to 1,200 men. They suffered heavily in the initial day's effort to capture Hostomel Airport, just outside of Kyiv. The lightly armored infantry vehicles that they were sent in with proved no match for Ukrainian anti-tank weapons and heavy artillery. An estimated 94 soldiers, almost 10% of their strength, were killed in just the first few days of fighting. By the end of the year, some accounts indicated their casualties numbered more than 500. Continued fighting showed that the unit was unprepared for the length of the war. Within just a few weeks of the invasion, locals back at the city of Kostroma, where the unit was based, were holding fundraising drives to send the troops warm clothes. The governor of the region, Sergei Sitnikov, a former CO of the 331st, commented a few months later that we need to help our guys so they have decent conditions. When he visited the wounded survivors, he brought with him care packages from relatives back home and civilian drones bought on the open market. If the conditions were this bad for one of Russia's most elite units, then it can only be much worse for the regular army troops. These same high casualty rates have been reported for all branches of Russia's armed forces. But since the best trained, most elite units are the ones that can be most trusted in a fight, those are the ones that can see the most intense combat, often spearheading assaults in battles around Mariupol, Bakhmut, and as we've seen with the 331st, the initial drives on Kyiv. The problem is, as Russia loses a significant portion of their combat veterans, they're being replaced with less well-trained and less skilled replacements. For a while, the Russian regular troops were supplemented by Prigozhin's Wagner forces, widely regarded as some of the most experienced urban fighters Russia had left. But Prigozhin's abortive march on Moscow resulted in him being exiled to Belarus, and his Wagner troops being split up between joining him in Belarus, signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense, or returning home to Russia. The Wagner forces had been responsible for the only sector where Russia had made any kind of incremental gains since the opening months of the invasion, that being around the area of the eastern city of Bakhmut. According to the US National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, who spoke to reporters on May 1, 2023, Russia had lost nearly 100,000 casualties in its 10-month siege of Bakhmut, including about 20,000 soldiers killed in combat and 80,000 wounded. Ukraine have lost about 1/5 as many in its defense of the city, according to US intelligence estimates, or around 4,000 killed and up to 15,000 wounded. It was clear that within the first few months of the invasion, that Russia had failed to allocate enough forces for the complete subjugation of Ukraine, and had vastly underestimated the number of casualties they would suffer. In September 2022, Putin announced a mobilization of 120,000 new troops, while a law was also passed making it a crime for anyone in Russia to call the invasion a war. Those 120,000 weren't enough, however, and further conscriptions raised the total to around 300,000 by the end of 2022. These nationwide call-ups have had a serious negative side effect. On top of losing 250,000 men as casualties of war, as many as 1 million additional young men and women have fled Russia to avoid the conscription. Many of those who left are the young professionals that Russia desperately needs and cannot replace. These emigres have left for various reasons, but their primary reason was to escape the mobilization, along with fleeing the Western sanctions that have caused enormous economic distress within the nation. This has led to a significant manpower shortage across Russia. In an intelligence update released on May 27, 2023, the British Defense Ministry observed that a survey conducted by the Russian Central Bank involving 14,000 employees had determined that Russia's national labor force was at its lowest recorded level since 1998. In addition to losses from the war and emigration to avoid the draft, the survey also showed that the Russian population had previously decreased by up to 2 million in the years between 2020 and 2022, due to several factors, including the poor Russian response to the COVID pandemic, poor healthcare and diet, excessive alcoholism, and an increasingly aging population. Nowhere has this lack of workers been more acutely felt than in the tech sector, where shortages of trained workers have hit the electronics and programming sectors hard. This brain drain, along with continuing Western sanctions, has caused what Laura Solanko, a senior advisor for the Bank of Finland, described as reverse industrialization. This means Russia has not only seen a shrinking of its economy, but has had to replace overseas investment, lost due to Western sanctions, with funds supplied by the state. Solanko reported such policies can only succeed with huge investments in domestic production to replace lost imports, as well as the construction of new transportation links to the east and south. As resources are limited, she continued, this implies less investment in other sectors, including potentially more productive areas. Russia's investments will continue to move away from the technological frontier, she said, which is why she considers Russia's current state of the economy as reverse industrialization. These factors combine to indicate that Russia will have increasingly fewer young men and women for Putin to draft in 2023, if he feels the need to repeat his previous mistake. On top of Russia's potentially catastrophic combat losses and manpower shortages, Russia is also facing another area of concern: the loss of their combat leadership. One of the most widely reported problems regarding the Russian army is a distinct lack of unity of command. Part of that problem is currently due to the combat losses which extend up the chain of command. As of November 2022, Russia had lost more than 1,500 officers in the first 9 months of the war, according to estimates by Ukrainian Colonel Anatoly Stefan, and backed up by studies done by the US Center for Naval Analysis. These reports suggest an estimated 160 of those 1,500 lost officers were generals, major generals, and lieutenant generals, as well as more than 150 colonels and lieutenant colonels, 250 majors, 296 captains, and nearly 500 senior lieutenants, in descending order of rank. While confirmed numbers, as with the lost Russian hardware, suggest a much lower number is more likely, it's clear that whatever the actual total is, Russia is losing far more officers of higher ranks than most Western armies would under similar battlefield conditions. As noted previously, one of the few areas where Russian military has been successful is with its private military companies, like Wagner, but there have been highly publicized clashes between Prigozhin, Wagner's leader, and the Russian military leadership in Moscow. Prigozhin has complained on multiple occasions that his private military group's needs have not been met. Meanwhile, whenever a high-ranking officer from the regular Russian army was fired, Prigozhin has been hiring them and adding them to his own private army, further distancing himself from Moscow. Prigozhin's march on Moscow was responsible for another loss for Russia. General Sergei Surovikin, the deputy commander of the Russian group of forces fighting in Ukraine, disappeared from public sight following the march and was rumored to be under arrest for knowing about Prigozhin's plan and not informing Putin. Surovikin's disappearance will be keenly felt across the entirety of the Russian military, as he was one of the most reliable ground commanders in the army, having attained his rank through skill and accomplishments, unlike those above him in the Russian chain of command who owed their position due to loyalty to Putin above all else. We've seen the many problems Russia is having with its troop losses and its population decline. How well is Ukraine doing in filling out its army? Ukraine has exceeded all expectations in lasting more than a year against a country nearly 30 times its size in area, 17 million square kilometers versus 603,000 square kilometers, and more than triple its size in population, 143 million versus 43 million for Ukraine. That widely accepted estimate of the Ukrainian population of roughly 43 million is contradicted by other sources. According to statistics compiled by England's The Economist newspaper, Ukraine, including Crimea and the Donbass, has lost about 16% of its population between its independence in 1991 from the former Soviet Union and the eve of the 2022 Russian invasion. These numbers suggest that Ukraine now has a population of only about 36 million, compared to around 52 million in 1991. But that's to be expected in a country where the invader, Russia, has indiscriminately attacked civilian population centers and has leveled whole cities, like Mariupol, which has seen its pre-war population of 400,000 reduced to less than 5,000. This same Russian effort to depopulate any area of resistance has been repeated across whole regions of Ukraine. According to the Joint Research Center of the European Economic Union, the EU, Ukraine will continue to see a steady decline in its population over the next 20 to 30 years, even under the most optimistic of circumstances. The JRC has estimated that by the beginning of February 2023, around 5.3 million Ukrainian civilians had been displaced internally across Ukraine, while approximately 7 million had emigrated to other countries, with around 4 million of those fleeing to nearby EU countries, especially Poland. This means that the invasion has displaced close to 30% of the entire Ukrainian population, both inside and outside of Ukraine. That accounts for the disparity between the pre-war estimates of 43 million for the Ukrainian population and the more recent 35 to 36 million figure. It would seem then that Ukraine could be facing a shortfall of the younger demographic that usually makes up military service recruits. However, those numbers belie the reality that an overwhelming number of volunteers have flooded the Ukrainian army, more than they can adequately train and supply. Since the beginning of the invasion in February 2022, Ukraine has seen a truly heroic response not just from within its own borders, but from abroad as well. An estimated 2,000 to 3,000 foreign fighters are believed to be serving in 3 battalions of a Ukrainian unit named the International Legion, according to analysts and academics monitoring them. But because the Ukrainian government wishes to keep such numbers private, these numbers are only best guess estimates. In the early months of the war, Ukrainian officials estimated that as many as 20,000 volunteers from more than 50 countries had arrived to help fight against the Russian invasion. But according to analysts and interviews with many of the foreign fighters who stayed, the vast majority appear to have returned home before the summer. Hundreds of the better-trained volunteers have since then been integrated into smaller units that operate independently of the International Legion. These groups, led by long-time regional opponents of Moscow such as the Georgian Legion and Chechen battalions, as well as other primarily Western units with names like Alpha, Phalanx, and the Norman Brigade. Some of the volunteers who stayed are being used to train young Ukrainian recruits, though their training is often rudimentary. Where a Western nation like the US would spend up to 10 weeks of training in boot camp, the Ukrainian recruits often get as little as 3 to 5 days, though most will get around 2 to 3 weeks. It's not just the total number of troops that Ukraine has that should be considered, but also the troops who are trained well enough to survive the most dangerous first few weeks of their deployment. It's also clear that the numbers of Ukrainian men and women who volunteered were more than the Ukrainian army could train early in the war. More than 140,000 Ukrainians, mostly men, have returned from Europe, according to a social media post by Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov from March 2022. Tens of thousands joined the territorial defense forces. According to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, between 9 and 12 new assault brigades totaling 40,000 men have been training for months to help spearhead the current counteroffensive. Their numbers were swelled by countrywide media campaigns that called on young Ukrainians, both men and women, to join up to help rid their country of the Russian invaders. One of the leaked assessment documents from February 2023, titled Russia-Ukraine Assessed Combat Sustainability and Attrition, compiled by the US Defense Intelligence Agency, suggested that Ukraine had suffered as many as 130,000 total casualties, including 17,000 killed in action and another 113,000 wounded. Ukraine has been very tight-lipped about their own casualty figures, so these numbers are merely best guess estimates. Overall, it can be seen that Ukraine does have less population from which to draw its military recruits, while sustaining very large losses over the first year of the war. Offsetting this has been a continued strong volunteer effort from both inside and outside Ukraine. The violence that Russia has unleashed on the Ukrainian civilians has convinced many in Ukraine, who would normally let others do the fighting, to step up and join their country in defending against the Russian invaders. No matter how long this war goes on, whether for months or years, it doesn't appear that Ukraine will run out of highly motivated volunteers anytime soon. The original question, will Russia run out of troops before Ukraine does, seemed at first to be an easily answered question. With 3 times the population, it would have appeared that Russia would simply be able to wear down Ukraine over years of relentless, grinding warfare. But the reality is, Russia's military is on the brink of collapse. Their best units have been shattered, and their ranks have been filled with ill-trained, poorly supplied, and poorly led conscripts. Their once vaunted dominance in tanks is now just a memory, and their artillery is being outfought and outshot by more accurate and longer-range systems supplied by the West. Russia's air force can't gain air superiority over the battlefield, while Russia's economy is so drastically damaged that they simply cannot replace the losses they've suffered in high-tech weapons. Ukraine appears motivated enough and well enough equipped that, if the war were to last another year or another 10, they'd never run out of people willing to fight to remove the last Russian occupier from their land. But what do you think? How close is Putin to completely running out of soldiers? Will Ukraine continue to be successful in replacing their short-term manpower deficit? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Imagine trying to invade a country without checking your combat vehicle storage to see if you have enough T-14 Armatas to actually pull it off. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what Putin seems to have done in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. You've probably heard it before, but we're here to say it again. Russia is running out of tanks, and it's embarrassing. But wait, Russia's military is supposed to be a force not to be reckoned with. How did it come to this? Is Ukraine so skilled at getting rid of these tanks, or is the Russian army somehow failing at utilizing the ones they do have? Had. Let's find out. Here's where it all started and quickly went from bad to worse. For Russia, of course. In the little more than a year since Putin began his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it hasn't quite gone as planned, Russian troops failed to take the capital Kyiv, facing extraordinary resistance from Ukrainians. As Ukraine began to receive advanced military hardware and support from Western countries, Russian troops were pushed back into the east of the country, becoming stuck in a devastating war of attrition. In both the war's early stages and current state of gridlock, one of the most notable trends are the enormous losses of manpower and equipment suffered by the supposedly superior Russian armed forces. Nowhere are these devastating losses more obvious than Russia's supply of tanks. And trust us, if you're waging war, you don't want to run low on those. While recent years have seen a number of predictions about tanks becoming obsolete, the war in Ukraine has demonstrated that they remain critical to modern land combat, featuring heavily in operations by both sides. Putin has repeatedly thrown huge amounts of armor into the conflict, hoping to overwhelm Ukrainian defensive positions. As a consequence, a February report by the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies found that the Russian military had lost at least half of all its entire pre-war fleet of tanks in the fighting, a figure which has only grown in the months since. In just a single day of combat during March around the key city of Bakhmut, Ukraine destroyed 21 tanks, 23 armored personnel vehicles, and 8 artillery systems. And as of early April, experts estimate that Russian tank losses exceed 2,000 vehicles in 14 months, while Ukrainian officials put the figure even higher, for reference. True, Ukraine has also taken heavy losses, with Russia recently claiming it has destroyed more than 8,300 of the country's tanks. However, Ukraine has been working to crowdsource reinforcement tanks from the West, while sanctions and international isolation have forced Russia to dig deep into its stockpiles from the days of the Soviet Union. That's pretty desperate. Unable to obtain the high-tech components it needs to build modern tanks like the T-14 Armata, Russia is now relying on hundreds of 60-year-old Soviet T-62s and 70-year-old T-55s. This is particularly embarrassing for Putin, who has flaunted his efforts to modernize Russia's military capabilities, spending billions in an attempt to once more turn the country into a superpower. So how did this cringy story of Russia's armed forces losing tanks by the dozens begin? The losses started during Putin's initial attempts to seize Kyiv. As Russian tanks and troops poured into the country, General Colonel Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's ground forces, determined that the Russian columns would need to advance along 2 or 3 major highways to enter Kyiv in their blitzkrieg attack. So Syrsky organized 2 rings of troops to defend the city, one in the outer suburbs and one in the capital, with as much space between them as possible, in order to minimize damage to infrastructure. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv, allowing them to easily target the highways and saving them from Russian airstrikes. This strategy proved to be extremely effective, allowing defenders to destroy many of the slow-moving tanks. But it gets better. There have been reports of entire companies of Russian armor being destroyed in deadly ambushes by Ukrainian hit-and-run teams using anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs. While relatively simple, ATGMs have proved to be an incredibly effective tool for destroying Russian armor. There are several main varieties of ATGM currently in use by Ukrainian troops. One is the domestically produced Stugna P, an older class of anti-tank weapon also known as the Skiff in its export version. The Stugna P's launcher and missile weigh a combined 60 pounds, making it a relatively large and heavy ATGM. It also relies on operator guidance, requiring its operator to keep tracking the target at all times while the missile is in flight. But even with these limitations, videos have flooded the internet of Ukrainians using Stugna P missiles to devastating effect. The Stugna P has a range from 328 feet to 3.1 miles, with a missile flight time of up to 25 seconds, depending on the target's range. It can also carry high-explosive anti-tank or high-explosive fragmentary warheads capable of penetrating modern tank armor. One benefit of the Stugna P is that despite being heavy, it can be mounted on a tripod, covered with camouflage, and piloted remotely on a laptop-like unit from up to 164 feet away. This has allowed the Ukrainian troops operating Stugnas to keep their units safe from retaliation by Russian tanks and artillery. And the system is simple enough for inexperienced operators to quickly become skilled, such as 42-year-old Ukrainian MP-turned-soldier Tetiana Chornoval. Chornoval worked as a Stugna operator during the Battle of Kyiv, where she and others used a number of hidden ATGMs to throw Russian tank columns into chaos. As she described it in an interview, "We saw tanks appearing and we literally ran to our position. I ran to my operator's case, I switch it on, and I see tanks on the screen. They just entered within the range of my missile. I took aim and destroyed the first tank. I shot it right at the fuel cells, and the ammunition was detonated. The tank literally flew off the road, and now it is somewhere in the road ditch in the forest." We don't know about you guys, but we're pretty impressed with Tetiana. With hundreds or thousands of stories like this, it isn't hard to see why even Ukraine's domestic ATGM system has proved to be bad news for Russia. Additionally, there are 3 main Western ATGM systems responsible for the bulk of destruction to Russian tanks. First is the American FMG-148 Javelin, jointly manufactured by defense giants Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Ukraine has received more than 7,000 Javelins since the start of the invasion. One of the Javelin's biggest strengths is its trajectory, as its missile travels in a high arc in order to strike the less armored section of a tank at the top of its turret. Javelins can also penetrate even the toughest tank armor, as they are fitted with 2 warheads. A primary charge disrupts the anti-missile countermeasures or armor, while a second charge penetrates and detonates inside the tank. However, this also makes Javelins expensive, at about $200,000 per unit and $78,000 per replacement missile. Cost aside, javelins have become a staple of Ukraine's defense throughout the war so far, even being turned into an inspirational internet meme termed Saint Javelin by Ukrainian-Canadian journalist Christian Boris. Even as the invasion shifted into its current brutal back and forth of artillery barrages and trench warfare, the Javelin has continued to prove invaluable to Ukrainian forces. But Javelins are just the beginning of our How Ukraine is Obliterating Russian Tanks investigation. Also critical has been the next-generation light anti-tank weapon, or NLAW, designed and produced by the Swedish company Saab Bofors Dynamics. The NLAW is shoulder-mounted, weighs only 28 pounds, has no backblast footprint, and has a firing range of 65 to over 1,950 feet. Like the Javelin, it utilizes fire-and-forget targeting, requiring no target guidance after firing. It also includes two fire modes: Overfly Top Attack, or OTA, where the missile uses magnetic sensors to detonate just above its target, and Direct Attack mode. The NLAW is also extremely practical, as it uses a non-explosive soft charge when fired, meaning it can be safely launched from indoors or enclosed spaces. While less expensive than the Javelin, the NLAW still runs at a pricey $33,000 per shot. But with their larger arsenal of ATGMs, Ukrainians have also gotten very good at mixing and matching, using each system in the tactical environment and situations where it will be most useful. As Anatoly, a member of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, currently fighting near Bakhmut, recently told a reporter, "I'm often asked which ATGW is the best, NLAW or Javelin. I will say from experience that it is best to use them in tandem. NLAW is excellent at close range, so it is indispensable when combat action takes place in urban areas like cities and villages, and the Javelin is best at a range of 1 to 2.5 kilometers, i.e. in the open field. Similarly, against lighter armored vehicles, Ukrainians will often now use the domestically produced Stugnas or Corsars, saving NLAWs for strikes on heavy tanks from concealed, often urban positions. That's another 5 starts for Ukraine's fierce weaponry. But we're not done yet. Lastly is the AT-4 anti-tank missile, also produced by Saab Bofors Dynamics, a disposable, recoilless ATGM. The AT-4 fires a single shot at a range of 650 to 1,950 feet. Designed during the Cold War, the AT-4 is also highly modular and can be loaded with a range of different warheads, some of which can penetrate tank armor up to 600 mm thick. Perhaps the AT-4's biggest advantage is its low cost. Each can be produced for under $1,500, and even less in Sweden. While there are numerous videos of Ukraine's armed forces using them to destroy multi-million-dollar Russian tanks. Since the invasion began, Ukrainians have also become more and more adept at using their arsenal of ATGMs, making it incredibly difficult for Russia to make any real headway. ATGMs, NLAWs, and AT-4s, oh my. Yes, Putin has been served a number of reasons to reconsider his invasion plans, but Ukraine isn't done providing him with a few more. Here's a terrifying and reliable weapon they've added to the pile. Another critical but often overlooked means by which Ukraine has wreaked havoc on Russian armor is with the use of landmines. Some of these are from the Soviet era, but the US also supplied over 7,000 shells of its Remote Anti-Armor Mine System, or RAM, in late 2022. The RAM is a 155mm howitzer shell containing 9 anti-tank mines. When the shell is fired over an open area, the tiny mines are scattered across the ground. This means that Ukrainian forces can lay the mines from a distance rather than by hand, without risking fire by Russian artillery. This makes them especially valuable in open spaces, where they can effectively stop an entire tank force. RAM's lethal power was on full display several months later, when Russian armed forces attempted to take the Ukrainian town of Vuhledar. In mid-February 2023, Russian losses due to the mines were so steep that the British Defense Secretary claimed an entire 1,000-man Russian brigade was effectively annihilated in one day. Reports like this make it easy to see how tank losses have become so enormous. But besides Ukraine's growing supply and talent for using anti-tank weaponry, there is another driving factor behind Russia's loss of more than 2,000 tanks, which has to do with its deeply flawed strategic approach to the conflict. Specifically with the backbone of Russia's invasion force, the Battalion Tactical Group, or BTG, a combined unit of tanks, infantry and artillery designed for lightning offensive operations. As Russian columns were devastated outside of Kyiv in early 2022, it became apparent that the BTG were not proving nearly as effective as they should have been. Most contained far too many tanks and armored vehicles with too little infantry support. So when they came under attack by Ukraine's mobile strike teams, there were not enough soldiers to repel the ambush, and Russian tanks were easy targets. This was compounded by Russia's failure to establish air superiority, which meant it was unable to supply close air support for its tank columns, the way the US did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Combined with Russia's myriad issues resupplying its front lines or repairing broken-down vehicles, and you begin to see just how things went so badly so fast for Putin. And because of all the elements above, Russian tank losses have only grown heavier in the following months of the war. During Ukraine's autumn counter-offensive into the Kharkiv region, for instance, Russia was losing as many as 10 battle tanks per day to Ukraine's 2, despite the fact that Russian troops were on the defensive. Most of the tanks destroyed were T-80s and T-72s, which began Russia's critical shortage of those systems. During that same period, Ukrainians reportedly captured over 560 vehicles and hundreds of extra ATGMs. Thus, in the grinding stalemate which has followed, Putin has had to rely on older and older equipment, most notably the T-55s and the T-62s. The T-55 is so old it literally qualifies as antique. The tank's prototype was first completed in 1945 and entered service with the Soviet Army in 1958. But reports indicate that in March of 2023, Russian troops began moving hundreds of them out of the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base in Khabarovsk, where they had been sitting in long-term storage for many decades. A recent photo showing a Russian soldier posing next to a T-55 somewhere in Zaporizhia Oblast seems to confirm their presence on the ground in Ukraine. The photo also indicates that Russia is sending the T-55s to Ukraine without upgrading them, as the tank in the photo appears to have the same infrared optics that were being used in the late 1950s. Similarly, there is no evidence that the T-55s have been reinforced with modern explosive reactive armor, and seem to be using the same thin steel body plating as they did during the early Cold War. This may prove to be an especially bad decision, since the T-55s also include the so-called jack-in-the-box flaw, which has doomed many of Russia's other Soviet-era tanks. Unlike modern battle tanks such as the German Leopard 2 or US M1 Abrams, which keep their shells away from the crew behind thick armored walls, older Soviet tanks store their ammunition in a carousel-style automatic loader, sitting directly below the main turret and crew. With only thin steel armor, a well-placed enemy shot can ignite the ammunition and easily blow up the tank. As Professor Robert E. Hamilton of the US Army War College put it bluntly, for a Russian crew, if the ammo storage compartment is hit, everyone is dead. He adds that the force of the explosion will instantaneously vaporize anyone unlucky enough to be inside. And that's far from the ancient tank's only weakness. As military journalist David Axe has written, the T-55 is from a generation of armored vehicles before modern optics, autoloaders, and multi-axis stabilization for their main guns, passive infrared optics, and sophisticated computerized fire controls. Essentially, all this makes the T-55 far less accurate and powerful than any other tank on the battlefield today, leaving them as easy targets for Ukrainian ATGMs and artillery. The Soviet T-62 isn't a whole lot better. It also suffers from poor armor and the jack-in-the-box flaw, as well as limited range and firepower compared with any modern tank. First introduced in 1961, the T-62 was once considered cutting edge, even into the 1970s. Many are equipped with either a TSH-2B41 or a TSH-SM41U gunner's sight and active thermal sights, which allow a T-62 gunner to fire about a mile during the day and about half that at night. This is about half the range of most modern tanks, making the T-62 a sitting duck in many situations. In an effort to slightly improve their effective range, Russia has so far pulled more than 800 T-62s from long-term storage and fitted many with 1 PN96MT02 analog thermal gunners sights. These sights are an upgrade from the T-62's original design, but have not been state-of-the-art since the 1970s, and have mostly been long since replaced with digital Sensor-U sights. But since the Sensor-U includes advanced French components now unavailable to Russia due to sanctions, they have had to make do with the older analog sights, making them essentially target practice for Ukrainians. Another huge issue with both the T-55 and T-62 is their discrepancy in barrel and ammunition size. Newer tanks such as the T-90, T-80 and even the T-64 being used by the Ukrainians have the same size barrel and can use common shells. By contrast, the barrel of the T-62 is 115mm and the T-55's is 100mm, meaning both that they cannot use modern ammunition and that they have issues destroying heavily armored targets. Making this worse is the T-55 and T-62's incredibly slow rate of fire. While the crew of a Ukrainian T-64, Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams can fire 10 to 12 rounds a minute, a T-55 or T-62 crew is lucky if they can manage 3 or 4. This reality is likely to get an even greater number of Russians killed in direct battles with Ukrainian forces as they become more and more outgunned. At the same time, Russian tank losses and reliance on older hardware has come hand in hand with catastrophic levels of casualties. The country is so far estimated to have lost some 200,000 to 250,000 soldiers. For reference, that is more than the US has lost in every one of its wars since World War II combined. In response, Putin has been forced to enact conscription, augmenting the Russian front lines with untrained conscripts, hardened criminals, and mercenaries. These troops are essentially forced to attack at gunpoint, and thousands have instead opted to mutiny, flee, or surrender to Ukraine once they reach the front lines. These mind-boggling numbers have also affected the Russian military's ability to properly resupply its tank personnel. Many of the 2,000 tanks already lost were destroyed with their crews still inside, leading to a serious shortage of soldiers with actual experience operating tanks, especially the more modern ones. Ukrainian analyst Alexander Kovalenko was recently tracking the shipment of more than a dozen restored T-72s, T-80s and T-90s to a Russian unit near Svatova in eastern Ukraine. But when they arrived, Kovalenko noticed that the most interesting thing is that there are no crews in the unit who can operate these tanks. Replacement crews for T-55s and T-62s can be trained in a relatively shorter time frame, as they do not need to be trained to use automatic gun loaders or sophisticated modern fire controls. The downside of this, of course, is that Russia now has extremely green soldiers using what amounts to rusting, obsolete weaponry. Down the road, this will create even more issues, as the crews currently being trained will not be able to effectively operate the more modern tanks, even if Russia is able to start their production. This degradation of manpower and training could prove to be an even bigger issue than Russia's dwindling military supplies, as effective recruiting and training will become harder and harder. Long-term, this could spell disaster for the Russian military and perhaps for Putin himself. With no way to replace modern tanks or the crews needed to operate them properly, it may prove impossible for Russia to remain a global or even regional power. The very presence of T-62s and T-55s on the battlefield is an indictment of Russian power and a sure sign that its armed forces are flailing. But what do you think? Will Russia's tank losses be a defining factor in the outcome of the war? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more content from military experts. Whichever way you assess the war in Ukraine these days, you'll probably be left wondering the same thing as everyone else. What on earth has happened to Putin's infamous Air Force? Fighter jets like this supersonic medium-range fighter-bomber aircraft, the Su-34, or this Su-57, a multi-role fighter capable of aerial combat as well as ground and maritime strikes, should be dominating the skies over Ukraine. But instead, they're either seen fleeing the battlefield or ungracefully falling onto the ground in flames. Try as they might, Russian combat aviators have failed to establish any kind of air superiority over the battlefield thus far. Today, we'll take a look at a few reasons why, starting with something called manpads. Don't be fooled by the name, these things have Putin's aircraft retreating left and right, and a quick dive into one of the most revolutionary periods in the history of military air power, the Jet Age. The coming of the Jet Age in the late 1940s ushered in profound changes in the field of aeronautics. Jets could fly faster, climb higher, and travel farther than their piston-powered predecessors, feats that would forever transform the commercial aviation industry. They would have major implications for military air power too. Jet propulsion was supposed to make air power king. If you could outrun the enemy in the skies, you could theoretically enjoy unfettered air superiority over the battlefield. At least that was the idea. Sound-shattering increases in aircraft speeds motivated designers to swap traditional guns for air-to-air missiles, their only hope of ever shooting a supersonic jet out of the sky. Missiles not only remain the preferred weapon for air-to-air combat, but revolutionize the very nature of air defense itself. Today, air defenses rely almost exclusively on surface-to-air missile systems, or SAMs, to prevent hostile air attacks. Impressively, technological advances in the 1970s made it possible to furnish vulnerable infantry with their own portable handheld anti-aircraft missiles too. Man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, are simple and cost-effective shoulder-fired rockets that lock onto aircraft using infrared homing. They can be taught to new users in a matter of a few minutes. Useful, right? Putin thought so too. Knowing Russia's numerically superior air force would play a central role in the opening phases of its invasion of Ukraine back in February of 2022, Western nations rushed thousands of MANPADS into Ukrainian hands to shore up their air defenses. These included American Stinger missiles, surplus Soviet eyeglass, and British laser-guided high-velocity Starstreak systems. The gamble paid off. Cheap MANPADS made it much harder for Russia's air force to establish aerial supremacy, imposing steep, asymmetrical costs on Russian pilots who could no longer safely approach priority targets in Ukrainian airspace. For the price of one $60,000 to $80,000 Igla, Ukrainian soldiers can down a $36 million Su-34 bomber or an $85 million Sukhoi Su-35S fighter. That's real bang for your buck. This has had real repercussions all over the battlefield. Modern combined arms warfare hinges on effective cooperation between all service branches – air, armor, artillery, and infantry. Because Russia has thus far been unable to provide active, continuous air cover for its ground units, tanks, logistic convoys, artillery, and infantry have been repeatedly caught out in the open and destroyed over the course of the war. A spectacle played out almost daily in combat footage littering social media for the entire world to see. Here's the bad news though. Despite Putin's failure to establish air dominance in Ukraine, this does not mean that Russian aircraft are not present over the battlefield or that Ukraine enjoys its own air superiority. Far from it. In a recent interview, Ukrainian troops on the front lines around Bakhmut told reporters that Russian aircraft still fly over the battlefield almost every day, sometimes a few times each day, but MANPADS have drastically reduced the extent to which they can linger over their targets. Here's how it usually goes down. Most overflights last only a few seconds. Fighter bombers flying in pairs or groups of 4 ingress to a target area at low altitude, maybe 50 meters or less, and then lob rockets and bank left or right and return back to base. Rather than hover over the front, far slower helicopters tend to operate similarly as airborne artillery platforms, approaching the contact line, firing their salvos of unguided rockets, and departing as quickly as possible. This has made it even harder for Ukrainian infantry to shoot down Russian aircraft. Constant vigilance is required since little warning is given. One soldier provided insight into the process. When the infantry shouts "incoming" and hides in the trenches, you have to run out and try to find the enemy's plane or aircraft. It doesn't matter if the enemy is shelling you or if it's calm. Your response has to be highly focused, and you have to have perfect sight and hearing to find a target at a distance of 3 to 5 kilometers. From the moment you've heard the sound, you literally have 3 to 5 seconds to run up and throw the MANPADS on your shoulder. Since timing is everything, concealed Ukrainians tend to target slower Su-20 fighter bombers and helicopters like the Mi-8. Hefting an 18-kilogram Igla onto your shoulder while sprinting out to the open and get a lock while the target zips overhead, then launching the missile knowing you're in mortal danger all within a span of 15 seconds or less, can you imagine how difficult that must be? The decentralization of air defense made possible by MANPADS like the Stinger has helped limit the effectiveness of Russian air power, but it hasn't blunted it altogether. According to former Staff Sergeant and Green Beret David Bramlett, A combat veteran who recently spent 11 months fighting the Russians in Ukraine, Russia could still turn things around if Western support wavers. Let's hope that doesn't happen, but even if it does, there's a chance Putin will take care of his air army's downfall all by himself. You see, lucky for Ukraine, Russia also has its own incompetence to thank in part for its lack of air superiority. Recently, accidents have taken their toll on Russian aircraft, with 6 crashes alone registered over the span of 2 months in late 2022. In September, a Russian Air Force Su-25 attack aircraft crashed just after takeoff after entering a left turn. Experts believe the crash was likely due to a technical fault or a pilot error. The pilot did not eject. A month later, an Su-25 fighter bomber careened into the courtyard of an apartment building in Yeysk, a western port on the Sea of Azov, during a training flight after its pilot ejected. The devastating crash injured 25 and killed at least 15 civilians, 3 of them children. According to Russian state media, the accident was caused by an engine fire sustained during takeoff. Just a week later, another Su-30 fighter entered a vertical dive and smashed into a 2-story residential home in Siberia, killing its 2 pilots in a fiery explosion. It was the second such fatal incident in 6 days involving a Sukhoi fighter plane. No civilians were killed. But the crashes don't end there, and they are happening on a wider scale than you may know. The avalanche of accidents reflects the toll the war has had on Russian aviation writ large. Reflecting on the aerial crashes, Michael Bonnet, an engineer and analyst at RAND Corporation, noted that what's interesting is that even aircraft not involved in the Russian invasion are crashing. In an interview with Business Insider, he said that while mechanical failures are expected in aircraft over time, a rapid increase in fleet-wide mechanical failures may indicate that something fundamental has changed. So what has changed? The war has placed immeasurable strain on Russian aviation. Colossal losses contributed to Russia's tendency to adopt more risk-averse tactics, playing a subordinate role to Russia's ground troops, according to Guy Plopsky, an Israeli defense analyst and Russian expert. In just 8 months, Russian combat aviators flew on average 150 sorties a day for a total of 34,000 combat sorties, but the number of sorties has greatly diminished. From an early high of 300 per day, Britain's Ministry of Defense estimates that now Russia probably conducts tens of missions per day. Very few of those sorties actually enter Ukrainian airspace. General wear and tear can be expected in any war, but the immense toll has seriously impacted Russia's pool of 7,500 relatively inexperienced pilots, who are said to receive roughly 100 hours of flight time per year, 1/3 less than their NATO counterparts. The lack of training limits their ability to conduct the type of massive air campaigns Western armies almost take for granted. According to Justin Bronk, an air power analyst, since Russian pilots are trained almost exclusively to fly in pairs and have little exposure to larger exercises, get relatively few flying hours compared to most NATO fighter crews, do not have support from tankers on most operations, and are not doctrinally trained for large air campaigns, it is perhaps unsurprising in retrospect that the Russian Aerospace Forces (VKS) proved incapable of conducting a Western-style war against Ukraine. Of a pool of around 300 modernized and 400 other frontline jets, Russia has sustained 72 air losses during the war, each costing tens of millions of dollars. The losses also include pilots, which are difficult to train and even more difficult to replace. Just ask Britain's RAF, itself suffering from a shortage of trained air crews, where it most recently had more F-35 Lightning II fighters than it had pilots, amid a 5-year waiting list for students to reach the front line. But the lack of qualified pilots is only one part of the problem. Russia also lacks skilled mechanics or the proper tools to make and fix the parts needed to keep Russia's modernized air fleet up to snuff. The fact that its pre-war stockpiles are dilapidated and rapidly diminishing only adds to the problems as the demand for specialized parts and repair tools grows. Russia has tried to mobilize greater amounts of manpower to address the human part of the problem, which, as you can imagine, has its own issues. Just like training pilots, you have to train the repair crews to diagnose and maintain extremely complex computer avionics and technical systems. That is, if you can get them. Herein lies another problem with Russia's Air Force. While mobilization certainly affected the small and medium-sized companies that make aviation parts, the random crashes and accidents began happening prior to mobilization. The shortage of manufacturing tools was already going on, which means Western sanctions may have had a role to play. Russia has been left in an economic and industrial vice by the West, squeezed out of its many traditional import-export markets where it has received the critical components it needs to keep its airplanes airworthy. Modern aircraft are outfitted with a deeply complex array of electronic systems. Computer targeting, special sights, communication relays, everything relies on critical electronic components previously available to Russia only on the import market. Moscow has previously admitted that it was 15 years behind the rest of the world, producing its own semiconductors, which isn't a good look when so many of today's precision weapons heavily rely on them. Russian manufacturers are now trying to source the components they need on the black market. But in the interim, Western sanctions and embargoes have forced the Kremlin to crack open stocks of its Soviet-era dumb munitions that lack computer guidance. Cannibalizing older pieces of equipment for spare parts is one way to try and stem the tide of aircraft losses, but it's hardly a good one. The result is an ad hoc, hodgepodge approach to combat aviation, hardly a combination any pilot anywhere should ever want to try. Some cases are pretty bad. It's reported that Russian pilots have been forced to tape commercial GPS devices to their cockpits for navigation, one report claimed. There are reports of Russian aircrews being so incompetent they leave the covers on aircraft sensors before takeoff. Another outlet claims their bombing accuracy has a mere 40% success rate compared to the pinpoint precision displayed by Western coalition forces during the campaigns in Syria and Iraq. We don't know exactly how effective Western sanctions have been in dulling Russian air power, but it has certainly played a role in suffocating access to the parts it needs to operate at the top of its game. In a war, every little bit of help goes a long way. There's no out-and-out answer as to why Putin has failed to establish air superiority. It is likely that a combination of factors, wear and tear, stress on older airframes, a lack of pilots and trained aircrews, and Western sanctions, have each played a significant role. What we do know is that thanks in part to their own outstanding courage, adaptability, and resilience coupled with the material support they've received from the West, Ukraine has managed to do a lot with a little in terms of its own air defense. Talks are still ongoing over the feasibility of supplying Ukrainian aviators with Western fighter aircraft. If this were to happen, we shouldn't expect much to change anytime soon. Much like the implementation of Western main battle tanks, it will take months, if not years, to furnish Ukrainian aviators with the tools they need to become truly proficient on unfamiliar systems like the F-16, the Eurofighter Typhoon, the Assault Mirage, and other planes. That said, we should never again underestimate the pluck of Ukrainian service members who have a penchant for proving us wrong. Why do you think Russian air power is failing? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Russia continues to pour older and older armor into the Ukrainian meat grinder. Is it running out of tanks? The number of tanks destroyed over the course of a year's fighting in Ukraine has been truly staggering. Yet despite premature predictions of the tank's imminent demise, it remains crucial to ongoing operations for both sides. But while Ukraine tries to crowdsource more tanks from the West, Russia has had to delve deeper into its surplus stocks from Soviet times. The country once touting its next-generation T-14 Armata is now sending T-62s into battle. It's not a good look for Putin and his Russian military, once considered the second best in the world. What's going to happen to Russian armor in Ukraine? We're now well over 300 days into a conflict many assumed would be over in a matter of weeks. With each passing day, more and more Russian vehicles meet their doom. Now, more than 8,700 pieces of expensive military equipment have been independently verified as either destroyed, abandoned, or captured. But this is just a minimum estimate drawn from publicly available footage. This number includes more than 1,500 tanks, almost 1,000 of which have been destroyed outright, with the rest either abandoned or captured. Russia deployed just 2,800 tanks at the start of the war, a number that at the time seemed insurmountable for the outnumbered Ukrainians. But the Pentagon recently announced that Russia has now lost half of its main battle tanks. Yeah, you heard that right. Huge losses were sustained during the Kharkiv counteroffensive last autumn, when the Russian army was reportedly losing 10 tanks per day, while the Ukrainians were losing just 2. Jarring figures when you consider the Russians were defending rather than attacking. Paired with the loss of over 110,000 Russian soldiers killed, wounded, and missing thus far, casualties described as orders of magnitude more than the Soviet Union experienced in Afghanistan in 10 years. The American Undersecretary for Defense recently argued that Russia will emerge from this war weaker than it went in. It does seem reasonable, if not plain obvious. Ukraine still has a long road ahead, but it enjoys material support from all over the world. Russia, on the other hand, does not. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to deduce that losses like these simply aren't sustainable over the long term. Pressure is mounting on Putin and his advisors. His once formidable armored force is slowly but markedly deteriorating. How did it all come to this? There's a lot of reasons why Ukraine is massively outperforming Russian armor on the battlefield. Russia's armored foibles derive first and foremost from two big factors: Ukraine's national resolve and its superior fighting doctrine. When fighting for independence, you simply do whatever it takes to win, even at great sacrifice. Ukraine has put its money where its mouth is, showing great heart on the battlefield despite dreadful material losses. Ukraine's tactical acumen has been on full display too. At varying points of the war, it has adapted a wide array of tactics to achieve specific operational ends. At the start of the campaign, it chose to employ its under-equipped, outnumbered forces in small, hit-and-run style teams. With Russian columns strewn out on exposed roads lacking fuel and infantry protection, this made the most sense. Small crews equipped with anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs could travel light until they reached an appropriate range, fire from concealed positions, and light out to safety before they were detected. This tactic played its part in turning the tide in the defense of Kyiv. When Western countries saw how adept Ukrainians were at knocking out tanks and vehicles worth millions of dollars with man-operated ATGMs worth a fraction of that price, they poured even more into the country. Far more accurate than anything the Russians possess. Ukraine's arsenal of ATGMs also came with easy access to Western trainers and advisors who could help their handlers become even deadlier and more efficient over time. The humble ATGM has become a symbol of Ukraine's stubborn resistance. Beyond the Ukrainian-made Stugna P, there are three primary Western ATGM systems responsible for dealing an insane amount of damage to Russian tanks. The American FGM-148 Javelin, jointly manufactured by Raytheon Missiles and Defense and Lockheed Martin, leads the way, with more than 7,000 provided since the start of the conflict. The missile's trajectory is its biggest strength, fired in a high, near-vertical arc and descending at blistering speed before detonating around the exposed, under-armored portion at the top of the tank's turret. Javelins can penetrate even the best anti-missile protection systems and armor because they are fitted with two warheads, not one. A primary charge disrupts the anti-missile countermeasures, while a secondary charge penetrates and detonates within the tank itself. Javelins are great anti-tank options, but their unique fire mode comes at a steep cost of around $200,000 per unit, with replacement missiles priced at around $78,000. Halfway through the conflict in the summer of 2022, however, Ukraine attributed between 30 to 40% of enemy tank losses to the British Next-Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon, or NLAW. Sounds fierce? That's because it is. The NLAW is an engineering marvel. Designed by Saab Bofors Dynamics, a joint Swedish-British venture, the original NLAW project started back in the 1990s and finished in 2008. It was agreed that the finished product would not exceed 28 pounds, would have a small backblast footprint, and could be fired at a target as close as 20 and as far as 600 meters away. The lightweight result packs a heavy punch. Operators can select one of two fire modes: Overfly Top Attack, or OTA, where the missile uses magnetic sensors to detonate just over its target at a perpendicular angle, or Direct Attack, or DA mode. The big draw of the NLAW is its ease of use, and the fact that it uses a non-explosive charge when fired, meaning it can be launched from an enclosed space like a room, a trench, or cramped urban environments. They are still quite expensive, priced out at around $33,000 per shot. The Swedes played an important role in the NLAW's development, but they were hardly done there. Saab Bofors Dynamics also produces the one-shot wonder, AT-4 anti-tank missile, which has dealt its own fair share of damage to Russian tanks. The disposable, recoilless, smoothbore launcher fires a single anti-tank missile from a light, fiberglass tube at a range of 200 to 600 meters. Designed during the Cold War, the AT-4 can fire heat, anti-structure tandem warheads, extended range, ER, high explosive, HR, high penetration, HP, and reduced sensitivity, RS rounds, whatever strikes your fancy, some of which can penetrate armor up to 600 mm thick. Widely adopted by the US Army as a replacement for the aging M72 law, it has been in service all over the world. So how is it faring in the Russian-Ukraine conflict? Thanks to the target-rich environment in Ukraine, there is now an ample body of evidence testifying to the AT-4's effectiveness. On January 16th, for example, a video surfaced on social media showing Russia's brand new T-90M Proryv 3 tank equipped with Nikita thermal camouflage burning in the Luhansk region. The $5 million tank had been destroyed by a cheaply manufactured Swedish AT-4 unit priced out at a mere $1,480. You could buy 130 AT-4s for the price of one Javelin, and that is incredibly good value for money. When you add in Switchblade anti-tank kamikaze drones and other anti-tank implements, you start to see why it has been so hard to make armored progress in tight cities, much less across the country's vast agrarian expanses. Ukrainians have grown more and more adept at using Western anti-tank missiles, and make no mistake, there is real skill involved when you factor the importance of target acquisition, good communications, accurate aerial observation, unit coordination, and other contingencies. Artillery bombardments called down to destroy broken or abandoned vehicles have been responsible for at least as many tanks as Western ATGMs, according to one Ukrainian infantryman. The Russians for a long time threw away tanks like they were wash rags, but they don't do that anymore, he said. Now I guess they're running out. Estimates place the rate of Ukrainian tank hits at 4 a day since the beginning of the struggle. That's like going outside and lighting tens of millions of dollars on fire every morning. Not exactly the outcome Putin might have hoped for. This is the chief reason Ukrainians are experiencing massive success whittling down Russian armored battalions. The trend shows no sign of abating. But there's another reason Russia has lost and continues to lose so many tanks, and it has to do with its tactical ineptitude. Russian tactical mistakes continue to mount. Derivative experts argue of a deeply flawed strategic approach from the Kremlin. This goes all the way back to the failed push on Kyiv. For quite some time, the Battalion Tactical Group, BTG, has been the backbone of the Russian military. Comprised of tanks, infantry, and artillery, this combined arms unit organization makes logical sense on the modern battlefield. However, Russia seemed to have gotten the balance of their BTGs all wrong, prioritizing armored vehicles, trucks, and tanks at the expense of the infantry needed to maintain, support, and protect them. Sure, this meant they would have hard-hitting, highly maneuverable units working in tandem, in theory, but in reality, when Russian BTGs came under attack, there simply weren't enough dismounted infantry to protect the armor or the logistic vehicles sustaining them. Convoys were caught in the open, eviscerated by the aforementioned Ukrainian strike teams laying in wait. Hiding in densely populated areas, forests, and other areas, the Ukrainians would fire, then flee to safety, leaving burning hulks of wrecked vehicles in their wake. If the Russians had chosen to include more infantry ahead and around their armored convoys, they would have been better equipped to detect and stop these ambushes. This wasn't the only problem. Russia's tactics were compounded by another fatal flaw. Since they don't enjoy air superiority, they couldn't rely on close air support to protect their armor. On top of that, it seems that they don't often survey the area with drones or aircraft, leaving armor exposed to Ukrainian infantry that are difficult to detect with the naked eye. It was constant, overwhelming air superiority and reliable intelligence that allowed American armored columns in Iraq and Afghanistan to thrive and survive, or at least avoid destruction by the thousands. Factor in the lack of sustainment, simple things like fuel, rations, and other vital necessities running out across the front lines, with the inability to salvage tanks that get stuck and abandoned in mud, and you have a recipe for disaster. Tractor-riding farmers of Ukraine, thank you for your donation. Over time, the attrition of his most experienced BTGs left Putin with no option but to funnel inexperienced conscripts into the fight. Russia is starting to move away from the battalion tactical groups as they realize how ineffective they are, but it's too little, too late. They wasted a massive amount of blood and treasure trying to make it work, and now they are left with undisciplined conscripts who appear more willing to abandon their tanks wholesale than try to salvage them or, barring that, destroying them to prevent them from falling into Ukrainian hands. More Russian tanks are being built to replace their losses, but can they be introduced faster than current models are being destroyed? The simple answer is no, unless they can build 30 tanks and armored trucks every single day. The average rate they are being destroyed. But that's just the beginning of Putin's tank problem. Though we don't often hear about their impact, Western sanctions on Russia have made it even harder to build the tanks and missiles it needs to prosecute Putin's war. Modern tanks are outfitted with a deeply complex array of electronic systems. Computer targeting, special sights, communication relays, everything relies on critical electronic components previously available to Russia only on the import market. Moscow has previously admitted that it was 15 years behind the rest of the world, producing its own semiconductors, which isn't a good look when so many of today's precision weapons rely so heavily on them. While Russia tries to recycle microprocessors from, yes, you're hearing it right, refrigerators and washing machines to rebuild its dwindling stocks, one British think tank claims that 27 types of captured Russian weapons all contained crucial components from 70 Western firms. Inflation has skyrocketed. Unemployment rates are creeping higher and higher as the absence of Western companies are felt. Industries are shutting their doors. Economic targeting of simple choke point components like ball bearings or fasteners by Western sanctions has had a huge impact. It can be the smallest things that are the hardest to find, where there might only be one source that produces them, the American Deputy Secretary for the Treasury said back in October. Weapons manufacturers are now trying to source the components they need on the black market, but in the interim, Western sanctions and embargoes have forced the Kremlin to crack open stocks of its Soviet-era dumb munitions that lack the computer guidance found so effective in today's models. Cannibalizing older pieces of equipment for spare parts is one way to try and stem the tide of armor losses, but it's hardly a good one. Taken together, many suspect these are the reasons that Russia's vaunted T-14 Armata program never got off the ground and onto the assembly line. Once purported to be the next-generation tank for the Russian armed forces, ambitious orders for thousands of T-14s, filed just a few years ago, remained completely unfilled. Russia has its hands so full maintaining its atrophying armed forces that it couldn't mobilize the resources and manpower to build a fleet of T-14s even if it wanted to. It's looking more and more likely that it won't be able to do it for a long time to come. So what do you do when your country lacks economic power, industrial capacity, and military readiness, but has to shoulder the burden of a rich historical legacy as one of the world's strongest military powers? Well, if you're Putin in 2023, it appears that you lean into that legacy. What Russia lacks in the traditional measures of power, it makes up for with acres and acres of Cold War stockpiles. Ironically, now that it has lost so much equipment, we are seeing footage of hundreds of old Cold War tanks pulled from storage, dusted off, loaded onto rail cars, and shipped to Ukraine. Russia has tens of thousands of old Soviet tanks in storage, including versions of the newer T-90s, T-80s, and their time-tested predecessors that make up the backbone of the Ukrainian armored force, the T-72 and the T-64. But footage is emerging of Russian T-62s being modernized at Russian armored repair plants and shipped to the front. These tanks are nothing short of obsolete in the modern era, and they have been since they started to be replaced back in 1975. Which begs the question, why are they bothering with all these Cold War relics at all? A lot of it has to do with how hard it is to maintain newer tanks in storage. Since they operate using more sophisticated electronic components that, as we well know, are more and more difficult to source, it seems that Russia has tried to pull bunches of T-72s, T-80s and T-90s out of storage, only to realize how expensive and difficult it might be to make them combat-ready. A fair portion of these were probably mothballed to begin with. As tanks are left in storage without maintenance, they atrophy. Rubber treads and wheels crack and chip, mice chew through exposed wires, armor rusts and corrodes. A true nightmare for Russian mechanics. The humble T-62 was mass-produced with one idea in mind: make it simple, make it good, and make a crap ton of them. Simple designs mean fewer electronics, greater ease of repair, and interchangeability of parts. Like that old reliable 1966 Chevy you have in your shed. No matter how many years go by, it will always seem to start right up. That's the type of tank the T-62 was. The fact Russia had something in the region of 20,000 of these in storage at the end of the Cold War means there are plenty of stocks to draw from. The bigger question is whether or not it's even worth it. Would Americans be happy if the US Army started dusting off Vietnam vintage M60 patterns from storage, slapping on a fresh coat of paint, better comms, and a pair of thermal sights and said, "Go to and prosper"? Of course not. But when has the Kremlin cared what its soldiers think? Repair plants across Russia are now churning out oodles of Cold War antiques. Most of these museums on tracks culled from deep storage that have not seen combat in decades, if at all, and their maintenance records reflect that. Some are being fitted with new engines, thermal imaging, bulkier armor, new comms, better optics, and cope cages. It probably won't be enough to protect their crews from certain destruction. one plant near Chita in Siberia has allegedly been tasked with refurbishing 800 T-62s by 2025. Some were used to defend the north bank of the Dnipro River after Ukraine's recent liberation of Kherson. We don't know how many will ultimately see combat, but we do know the mere presence of T-62s on the battlefield in Ukraine is an indictment of Russian power. Talks to provide the Ukraine with Western main battle tanks continue, but at the end of the day, Ukraine is capturing and repurposing far more abandoned Russian tanks than they will ever receive from the West. If a new Russian offensive is right around the corner, as many experts believe, they'll need to try to conserve their dwindling armored force if they hope to avoid campaigning with a military propped up by scores of refurbished T-62s. As backwards as it might be to say this, sometimes old equipment is enough to get the job done over the long haul. This may even be Putin's diabolical plan. He knows that if the West buckles and does not commit to supplying Ukraine with the armor it needs to continue fighting, waves of Russian conscripts and mercenaries using outdated equipment might just be enough to attrite, suffocate, and bleed the Ukrainians dry, even if it means he has nobody left at the end of the war to celebrate his hollow victory. Let's hope that possibility doesn't come true. But what do you think? Will Russia's continued loss of tanks be a defining factor in the outcome of the Russian-Ukraine war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Wars cost money. Every bullet fired, every building bombed, every intercepted missile. Each of these actions comes with a hefty price tag. But how exactly do you calculate the financial burden of war, say, on a daily level? To put it bluntly, it ain't easy. But our military experts are here to break it down for you. Today, we are diving into the jaw-dropping daily cost of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So sit down, grab your ledger books, and buckle in. Oh, and spoiler alert, this may shock you. Of course, we lead with the necessary disclaimer: it is impossible to know the exact cost of a war on this scale, or any scale, in terms of blood and treasure. You and I both know that as war itself unfolds under its own fog in real time, the precise number of shells fired, soldiers killed, buildings destroyed, or, for example, the true acreage of agricultural yields lost to hidden mines, unexploded cluster bombs, remnants of rockets, and shellfire riddling the countryside remains obscure. Sometimes historical clarity never comes. Decades after the cataclysmic global conflicts which defined the 20th century, historians, economists, and analysts continue to debate the scale of the destruction, the true human cost, and the financial ramifications of World Wars I and II. For those of us watching a conflict from afar which hasn't even ended yet, the task is not an easy one. The financial effects of this war will reverberate in ways we can't even comprehend for decades to come. Suffice it to say that from public international sources which we have been able to consult, it should come as no surprise that though the cost is astronomical, it is by no means a perfect representation. In war as in peace, nearly everything costs something. To show how we've tried to enumerate the daily cost of the war today, let's start with a thought experiment. Try to imagine an average day in Ukraine. At the time of writing, Ukrainian forces are waist-deep into their summer counter-offensive, attempting to penetrate Russia's defensive fortifications from the southern to the northeastern tip of Ukraine. On any given day, you have small firefights and larger supporting probing maneuvers within distinct pockets across Ukraine's 1,000-kilometer front line with Russia. And big or small battles are expensive. Soldiers paid a daily wage carry hundreds of bullets and dozens of grenades with them into battle, clearing garbage-strewn Russian trenches of their occupiers as dozens, hundreds, even thousands of artillery shells are fired by each side in support. Drones, some of them expensive military makes, but the vast majority inexpensive commercial offerings, linger overhead to provide reconnaissance, direct added firepower, and fire support. The price of the soldiers' wages, the ammunition expenditures, and the drones alone required to wage the ongoing counteroffensive must be staggering, but that barely scratches the surface. Tanks and vehicles factor in too. Both sides employ a vast array of armored vehicles, tanks, artillery, rocket systems, personnel carriers, and civilian vehicles at any given moment, some donated by external countries, some furnished by Russia and Ukraine themselves. Each of these has a paid crew tasked with operating them. When they are damaged or destroyed, each side attempts to salvage what they can. Fixing vehicles requires additional mechanics, tools, and spare parts, which add up. As you zoom out, the expenses multiply. Soldier welfare is a major cost as both sides employ them by the hundreds of thousands. They need money, food, clothing and equipment to subsist in the field, and medical services if wounded. Getting a wounded soldier to the rear hospital means you must factor in the cost of the ambulance employed, the fuel expended, as well as the cost of the medical equipment, the medical staffs, and the medevac itself. They are taken to hospitals which may run on skeleton staffs, but whose own infrastructure commands its own financial attention. In death, both sides must keep morgues running, pay family stipends and funeral costs, and we're still only beginning. Soon, the civilian sphere comes into the picture, and here the war's destruction has been arguably far more devastating than on the front lines. The World Bank estimates that Ukraine has incurred $400 billion worth of destruction in collateral damage, epitomized by the waves of cruise missiles and random criminal attacks on civilians, which regularly rain down on Kyiv. Reconstructing damaged apartment blocks, water mains, sewage lines, power grids, and if you happen to be in Bakhmut or similarly devastated places, literally entire cities, and you start to see the scales involved. Harder still to contemplate is the relative economic consequences of the war's refugee crisis. An estimated 8 million Ukrainians and hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled their respective homes, some by force, others by choice. Within Ukraine, another 5 million are internally displaced. The towering economic cost of not just providing transport, food, and accommodation for these people, but also the relative shock to the domestic economic system by their absence and long-term effects of the brain drain may cripple both nations' financial outlooks for decades to come. Then you wonder what it might take to rebuild things like the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine, whose floodwaters devastated towns and villages downstream. Oh, and we still have the robust coalition of Western and other nation-states donating weapons, military equipment, and aid by the hundreds of billions every year. Many of these countries rationalize this as a small price to pay to have Ukraine virtually dismantle Russia's once vaunted arsenal. And yes, Putin is burning through soldiers, planes, helicopters, missiles, tanks, political capital, and other military resources at an alarming rate. But it all begs the question: is it sustainable? Can Putin continue building new fortifications in and around Ukraine as the counteroffensive unfolds? Can he sustain the cost of massive warships sunk, the careless hemorrhaging of Russian conscript forces thrown into the meat grinder willy-nilly, the omnipresent pressure on the Russian economy imposed by Western sanctions? Some analysts have estimated that Russia, increasingly cut off from a huge chunk of the global economy and left with many of its goods unsold, has already lost $1 trillion on the war thus far. One thing is certain: if Putin doesn't give the order to cut his losses, the bleeding will not stop anytime soon. The long-term economic ramifications could be seismically bad for Russia. That said, let's get down to brass tacks. Let's begin by factoring in some averages for Russia alone. Over a 9-month span, it was estimated that Russia expended anywhere between 10,000 and 50,000 artillery shells a day. We know the average cost of a Soviet-caliber artillery shell is about $1,000, so that means that Russian artillery costs hover at upwards of $50 million a day. Multiply that out over a 16-month span and you easily have tens of billions of dollars spent by Russia on artillery shells alone. Estimates put Russia's missile expenditures over that same 9-month span at $12 billion, with each one costing a cool $3 million. What's more, Russia has lost almost 300 combat aircraft, with those coming in around $18 million apiece, and 261 helicopters, each costing on average $10.4 million. Total aviation losses over 9 months, somewhere in the region of $8 billion. We all know the dismal combat record of Russia's tank crews, and how a cheap $100 Chinese drone using a 3D printed release mechanism can drop a single anti-tank munition and knock out a vehicle worth tens of millions of dollars. Well, we should go through Russian vehicle losses just to get a taste of what this war has cost Putin and his people. To date, Russia has lost 2,114 tanks. If a T-64 costs $1.1 million, a T-72 costs $1.2 million, and a T-80 costs about $3 million, a T-90 will set you back $4.5 million. The confirmed cost of losing these models destroyed, abandoned, or captured alone would be as follows: 56 T-4s, $61.6 million, 1,112 T-72s, $1.33 billion, 537 T-80s, $1.61 billion, 68 T-90s, $306 million. That is a cool $3.3 billion on tanks alone. Then you have to add in the cost Russia has incurred trying to repair and maintain its aging tank fleet in the field, as well as the costs of every single truck, armored vehicle, and personnel carrier confirmed destroyed in Ukraine, and experts say that Russia has lost about $20 billion worth of vehicles. It seems relatively cheap to keep an average Russian soldier on the battlefield in Ukraine. On average, after all, it costs the Kremlin just around $200 per month for each soldier. But we also know that last September 2022, Russia mobilized 300,000 new conscripts, on top of several hundred thousand forces already in the field. It was reported in January of 2023 that Putin authorized another mobilization of some 500,000 soldiers. Since it is unclear when these forces will make their way onto the battlefield, let's simplify things a bit. How much would it be to keep just 300,000 conscripts on the battlefield over a 9-month span? 300,000 soldiers paid $200 a day for 9 months amounts to $16.44 billion. Stretch that out to another 7 months, the current length of the conflict, and the increasing number of mobilized soldiers, and we can safely estimate that the bill will come in somewhere in the region of $30 billion. Die in battle and the costs continue to mount. Reports indicate that Russia pays the families of deceased soldiers a death compensation of 7.4 million rubles, or $110,000 per soldier. There's no clear indication of just how many Russian soldiers have actually died in Ukraine, but we know the number is incredibly steep. On the conservative side, there are some indications that around 40,000 Russians have died thus far. If this is the case, then the Russian government has shelled out around $4.4 billion to the bereaved loved ones of its fallen dead. What of the Russian casualties, at least those that make it to the aid stations and aren't brutally left behind by their comrades? What does it cost for their treatment? In war, it is generally a safe estimate that for every death, there will be around 3 times that number wounded or missing. That's over 100,000 men, which would be another $5 to $10 billion to treat. It's tough to say exactly, but for those who have sat down and honestly tried to crunch the numbers, experts estimate that Russia's venture in Ukraine is costing $10 billion per month, for a total cost of $160 billion over the past 16 months. Mobilization has wreaked havoc on Russia's domestic economy. Some say that the country is in the midst of a massive brain drain, having lost 1 million of its best and brightest workers over the last year alone, many of whom fled the country outright. To replace these educated and skilled laborers, you have to find replacements and train them, a very costly thing to do. In most cases, Russia can't afford to even do that, and has had to vastly scale back, even shut down many of its firms. That tends to happen when you mobilize hundreds of thousands of men all of a sudden without a graduated plan to compensate for their absence in the domestic sphere. Russian industrial production has contracted 5% over the last month. One former advisor at Russia's central bank recently told NPR that as Western sanctions continue to freeze Russia's economy, it has increasingly attempted to take over foreign assets within its borders to compensate for its financial and industrial losses. It is a sign that despite what Russia is telling the world, its long-term economic health is not as resilient as it may seem. If you're a Russian billionaire or oligarch, the war has not been as profitable as others may have been in the past. It is estimated that the Russian upper crust has lost around $93 billion worth of assets in 2022 alone. Normal Russians are becoming more and more frugal, saving their money for when times get even leaner. What this means is that Russian commercial markets are on the verge of long-term stagnation. Goods imports are down 20% from 2021. Technology imports have decreased by 30%. Car production is down by 67%. Russian arms exports, once a crown jewel in the Russian economy, have slumped. Even if Russian GDP hovers around the estimated $2 trillion, a figure the IMF endorses, it is spending a lot on fighting. How much military spending, you ask? Well, in 2020, the so-labeled second most powerful nation in the world spent $61 billion on its military, a not insignificant sum when you think about how much it had to maintain. Well, that figure jumped 6-fold in 2022, with Russia spending $346 billion to try and re-inject life into its stillborn invasion. Russia has been paying for this war entirely from its own pockets, unlike Ukraine, and it will be feeling that down the road. But figures revealing the true cost for Russia are often at variance with one another. Take, for example, a recent Special Operations Forces report, which alleged that the war was not costing Russia $10 billion a month, as we tallied earlier, but an even steeper $900 million per day. Breaking it down even more, we'd see Russia shouldering military expenditures of around $27 billion a month, or $432 billion for the 16 months that have passed. These might be ballpark figures, but it might be closer to reality than we think. The country's economy has been fractured, its military potential is severely crippled. How long can Russia sustain these losses? Over a 2-day span during Ukraine's counteroffensive last month, Russia was said to have lost 48 artillery platforms, 2 fighter jets, and 2 helicopters. One of the fighters was a Sukhoi Su-34, which costs anywhere from $40 to $50 million. The other, an Su-35, which costs from $40 to $65 million. Hundreds of millions of dollars lost in the time it would take for you to travel from one side of the world to the other. Putin has to hope the Russian bear has deeper pockets for the hard fight ahead. Ukraine is facing an equally grim financial future, if not far more so. Yes, it has been supported at every step by incredibly generous donations from countries around the globe, but with its cities, fields, and forests acting as the war's primary theater, material destruction has rained down on Ukraine on par with some of the largest wars in history. Last year, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky estimated that, not counting reconstruction costs, it took around $5 billion per month to keep the war going. If Ukraine hopes to continue the war, Western donations will have to keep coming. That is, as long as Western governments can convince their populations it is in their interest to do so. Let's assess some of the numbers from January 2022 to January 2023. So far, more than 30 nations have funneled military equipment into the country. The US has donated the most military aid over that span, giving just under $50 billion, including the game-changing HIMARS rocket launcher systems, self-propelled artillery, M2 Bradleys, and soon, M1 Abrams tanks, and the latest anti-tank weapons. This dwarfs the second-place donor, the United Kingdom, who was given $5.13 billion. After them, you have Poland, who was given $2.5 billion, Germany $2.47 billion, Canada $1.35 billion, and the Netherlands at $0.9 billion, and Italy, France, Norway, and Denmark all just under $1 billion. Relative to a country's GDP, however, many smaller nations, especially those in the Baltic and in Eastern Europe, have been punching above their weight. While the US would rank 8th in terms of aid donated relative to GDP, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania have given more than their fair share. Among other things, Ukrainian troops are road testing real-time online information and networking systems, drone jamming guns, and maritime remote-controlled kamikaze boats, expensive Western systems that take real know-how and expertise to operate within a combined arms setting. They are improving their intelligence and surveillance-gathering efforts. They are becoming experts at psychological warfare, joint operations, and sustainment logistics. It's been a whirlwind crash course, to say the least. But they have not worked alone. As far back as 2014, Ukrainian officers were receiving Western training, especially from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other European nations. These programs, arguably more than the weapons and munitions themselves, are conferring Ukraine a distinct battlefield advantage. We aren't sure how much these training programs cost, but while they certainly aren't cheap when you factor in the salaries of the instructors, translators, and other observers, the munitions and vehicles utilized, the transport and accommodation for Ukrainian forces abroad, and the training programs being taught, they have undoubtedly proven their worth. Another dimension of aid doled out to Ukraine has not come from the governments, but from private corporations, charities, and multinational organizations. Companies from Elon Musk's SpaceX, which provided Ukraine with Starlink satellite internet use, to Amazon, which provided over $50 million in tech for logistics and cybersecurity, to all the sleeping bags, cold weather gear, cooking equipment, field generators, first aid kits, clothing, and fuel units they might need in the field. Private citizens have shown how normal people, when working together, can achieve incredible things. Pooling together their resources, the citizens of European and other nations have donated hundreds of millions of dollars to the Ukrainian cause, with the Czech Republic, Taiwan, and South Korea alone donating $171 million, $33 million, and $3 million respectively. Some countries like neutral Austria provided 500,000 vaccine doses rather than money or military gear. Other countries like Azerbaijan helped deliver humanitarian aid to refugees. Taken together, all these costs add up to astronomical levels. from ammunition expenditure to destroyed vehicles and infrastructure, soldier and civilian hospitalization, humanitarian donations, and urban reconstruction, you are able to come to a reasonable estimate of what the war has cost thus far. The Kiel Institute for the World Economy in Germany, for example, said in February 2023 that aid from the world's nations added up to around $150 billion. In 10 months, Ukrainian officials tallied up 149,300 destroyed and damaged residential buildings, 131,400 private homes, 17,500 apartment buildings, and 280 dormitories, adding up to another $54 billion, or $5.4 billion per month on average. If you add in the extra months, you get somewhere in the ballpark of around $80 billion, or $180 million each and every day, just to repair damaged housing. The infrastructure toll is also extensive. In early December 2022, Ukraine's Ministry of Development of Communities, Territories and Infrastructure said that in 10 months, Russia had destroyed 150 bridges and overpasses, amounting to $35 billion. Extend that for the remainder of the war, and you get more than $53.4 billion, or $118 million on bridges and overpasses alone per day. That doesn't touch on the 3,000 educational institutions struck by Russia, including 1,400 secondary schools, 865 preschools, and 505 institutions of higher education, costing $8.6 billion over 10 months, or an additional $28.67 million a day. The Kyiv School of Economics also said the 907 damaged cultural facilities, the 168 sports facilities, the 157 tourism facilities, and the 95 religious facilities would cost another $3.3 billion in 10 months, or $7 million a day. They chalked up more costs too: $6.6 billion for agriculture, $2.9 billion for transport, $2.4 billion for trade, $2.3 billion for utilities, $2.2 billion for culture and sports tourism, $1.7 billion for healthcare, $6.6 billion for energy, $700 million for electronics, $300 million for social and financial setbacks, and $14 billion for ecological damages, and you get $137.8 billion in damages over a 10-month span. Averaged out, that is over $206.7 billion in 15 months, or $458.33 million a day for Ukraine's domestic reconstruction alone. When you add Ukraine's $207.6 billion in cost to Russia's total of $405 billion, you get $612 billion combined, or $1.36 billion a day. But wait, there's more. Ukraine must also pay its 1 million soldiers, who receive more than double the monthly wages of their Russian counterparts, at 20,000 hryvnias or $550 a month. Those in the heat of battle can make up to $2,700 a month with a frontline combatant bonus. Ukraine spent $31 billion on its military in 2022. It spends 15 million hryvnias to compensate a fallen soldier's family for his or her loss, over $400,000. So if 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers died, that would be an additional $20 billion in compensation. Ukraine's economic hit has been ruinous. Nearly half of its companies shut their doors in 2022. Its GDP was down 30% in 2022, losing an estimated $70 billion in revenue from the war alone. Ukraine will have to pay back tens of billions of dollars of loaned capital. There have been inflationary price hikes. Ukrainians are worried about not having food, being able to heat their houses or light their rooms at night. This is all relatively easy to account for. But when you try to add up the war's silent toll, from the tangible costs of burying more than the estimated 9,083 Ukrainian civilians killed in the crossfire and settling their estates to the intangible cost of war-related distress stemming from the unnatural exposure to abuse, violence, and the unexpected loss of friends and family, and you are left with a mental health crisis whose effects will linger, possibly for generations. How can you reasonably put a price tag on this? If the Ukrainian government is true in saying 60% of its soldiers have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, the knock-on effects will be akin to past wars, only worse. Alcohol abuse, suicide, depression, and anxiety tend to accompany PTSD diagnoses, and without adequate programs to treat them, Ukraine and Russia will both suffer not only from a massive, long-term economic hit as individuals wrestle with the aftermath of this conflict, but a jarring emotional and mental human one as well. Reconstructing Ukraine may be a $1 trillion endeavor, but most of what the war has taken can never be replaced. But what do you think about the West's financial support in its defense against Putin's aggression? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a disaster, and it's no wonder. The man is a paranoid megalomaniac who goes around poisoning his opposition's underpants, uses outdated Soviet-era weapons and tactics on the battlefield, and isolates himself from the world to a degree that is clearly eating away at his sanity. And that's not all. If you haven't heard this before, we're here to talk about it today. Putin is a thief. While there are numerous military mistakes that Russian generals and armies have made, the mistakes begin at the top with Putin himself. No surprise there, right? But you may be surprised at just how vast and crazy this sea of mistakes, dirty little secrets, and even just basic stupidity really is. Here's the scoop. You can tell how big a thief Vladimir Putin is by how many articles and documentaries have been made about how he's stolen Russia blind. One pertinent article is literally titled just that, Stealing Russia Blind, written by Harley Balzer and published in the Journal of Democracy. In the article, Balzer points out that Putin has established a sistema, the Russian word for an established and accepted system, based on massive predation that has produced the most unequal wealth distribution in any developed economy. Estimates have suggested that Putin and his oligarch cronies have stolen more than $1 trillion worth from the Russian economy since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. But that is just the beginning of Putin's kleptocracy story. Putin's experience with government-level theft started early, long before he reached Russia's throne, when he managed to steal $124 million worth of funding that was designed to feed the starving population of St. Petersburg in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1996, he was able to protect his boss, St. Petersburg Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, when Sobchak lost an election over a corruption scandal and fled the country, an escape arranged by Putin himself. That ability to protect his corrupt friends is what garnered attention by the equally corrupt Russian President Boris Yeltsin in 1999, who was leaving office during an investigation into his own massive corruption. Estimates by 4 different worldwide organizations of the level of endemic corruption in Russia suggested that at a minimum, $30 billion a year was being stolen from the Russian economy. That amounts to 10 to 12% of the national GDP, and that was just what the investigators could prove. Eventually, those losses cost his country dearly. Money that should have gone to train soldiers, to modernize equipment, to keep planes flying and tanks in working order, to simply fill up their gas tanks, all this had been stolen from Russia's military. That higher figure of $1 trillion worth of theft was mentioned again by investigator Bill Browder, who also suggested that Putin's net worth alone is in excess of $200 billion. These funds could have also gone to better roads, better healthcare, and better everything in Russia, not just a better military. But it's the kleptocracy rampant in Russia's military that the invasion of Ukraine has brought front and center. Russia has been undergoing a much vaunted modernization effort that's been ongoing since 2008, but these efforts have failed to root out Putin's personally embedded sistema, which is present in all levels of Russia's military. The army's infantry commanders frequently inflate the number of active personnel in their units, and from the excess, those commanders steal the surplus funds for themselves. The accounting is continually plagued by falsified numbers of both men and material, which leads to false appraisal of the unit's true combat capability. But the units are not only plagued by missing soldiers and supplies, their lower-level commanders and sometimes the soldiers themselves have sold available gear and even their own vehicles' gasoline for money or traded them for alcohol. All branches of the armed forces generally have unreliable and opaque reporting up and down the command chain, which has led Russia's leadership to believe its forces were better quantitatively and qualitatively than they really were at the start of the invasion. And with the lack of available gear for their newly mobilized troops, some soldiers or their families have had to resort to buying their own weapons, their own bulletproof gear, and sometimes even their uniforms. That's just sad and weird. And it's about to get weirder. Putin is personally responsible for the 3 segments that underpin his rule as an autocrat. He perpetuates his rule by maintaining absolute secrecy. He isolates himself from reality by listening to only a very select few advisors, and he surrounded himself with yes-men whose only redeeming quality is their unwavering loyalty. Since the beginning of the invasion in February of 2022, Moscow has, if anything, doubled down on silencing frank discussion of the conflict, even going so far as to criminalize assessments of combat deaths and forecasts about how the war might unfold. criticism of the war, it's still technically a crime to call Putin's special operation a war, though some media darlings have finally used that term, remains completely off limits, including discussion of military incompetence and the absence of accountability that has led to the military's serious problems inside of Ukraine. This censorship makes it hard for the military elite to get accurate information on what's going wrong in the war, which in turn hampers their efforts to correct their mistakes. Meanwhile, the level of secrecy that Putin has made an intractable part of the Russian sistema was one of the biggest reasons for the early failure of the invasion. The self-defeating deception caused by Putin's decision to prioritize operational secrecy and domestic blindness to the impending war led to a notable lack of adequate planning. Pre-invasion secrecy led to avoidable problems that specifically affected the initial application of Russian air power. Russian pilots had gained some experience fighting air battles in Syria, but operations there had taken place over mostly uncontested desert terrain, where enemy opposition could be spotted and dealt with long before it became an actual threat. Russian pilots had almost no experience fighting over a forested country like Ukraine, a much more defensible and far larger area than the rebel-held enclaves in Syria. These pilots also hadn't trained against an opponent with any kind of layered air defenses and numerous man-portable air defense systems or manpads that Ukraine possessed. Russian pilots were given little to no training in such tactics before the invasion. That unpreparedness is partly why Russia has been unable to establish air superiority over the Ukrainian battlefield, and why they've met with such heavy losses in the air. Another factor in the failure of the air assets was how Russia decided to employ their forces. Because their ground troops were in grave danger within days of the invasion, the Russian Air Force had its primary objective switched from suppressing air defenses to providing close air support, which in turn brought them into greater danger from the numerous Western-supplied manpad systems. These missions forced Russian pilots to engage targets at low altitudes, which placed them well within the range of cheap and numerous anti-air missiles, like the US-made Stinger. After the first few months of this, Russia found itself not just suffering unacceptable losses of expensive aircraft and helicopters, but also significant drain of their trained pilots and aircrew, which take months or years worth of training to replace. And while all this is going on, Putin remains in his creepy little cave of isolation and delusions of grandeur. Not only is Putin's insistence on secrecy a major problem, but he has insulated himself from the reality of the world by relying on just a handful of advisors. By orchestrating the invasion with just a handful of military advisors, many of whom earned their positions not by being good strategists, but by being loyal to a fault, Putin created a plan that had no basis in reality. For example, the primary invasion thrust south from Belarus toward Kyiv brought only enough rations for the troops and fuel for their vehicles to last 2 to 3 days. The level to which Putin and his advisors were out of touch with reality was displayed by the troops who carried with them dress uniforms for their expected victory parade in the middle of the capital. Putin's invasion plan was filled with faulty assumptions, arbitrary political goals, and planning mistakes that ignored key Russian military principles. The initial invasion called for multiple unsupported lines of attack, with no reserve forces, tying the military to far-flung objectives that were unattainable for the modest size of its ground forces. Due to such isolation, Putin erroneously believed that his war plans were sound, that Ukraine would not put up much resistance, and that US and NATO support would not be strong enough or arrive fast enough to make a difference. The invasion plan, reinforced in Putin's mind by his sycophantic comrades, painted a picture of the valiant Russian army riding unchallenged into the territory of Ukraine. The brotherly Ukrainians would welcome them with open arms and would thank them for rescuing all of Ukraine from their neo-Nazi and corrupt drug-addicted leadership. The overmatched Ukrainian forces would run at the first sight of overwhelming Russian forces. After Kyiv fell within 3 days, the liberators would then receive a warm greeting in the southern and eastern regions of the country. The Russian elder brothers would then install a properly subservient government in Kyiv that would gratefully accommodate any demands Putin placed upon them. It came as quite a shock then when Russia's troops, which along with its direct leadership had no inkling that they were going to be an invading army, and ran headlong into a fierce and unified Ukrainian resistance, supported by unexpected amounts of advanced Western weaponry and accurate satellite-supported intelligence. The three-pronged invasion suffered far more casualties than they either expected or could cope with. According to Russian doctrine, any major-level war, such as the Ukraine invasion, should have begun with weeks of air and missile attacks targeting an enemy's military installations and critical infrastructure. Russia's planners consider this the decisive period of warfare, with Air Force operations and missile strikes lasting between 4 and 6 weeks, designed to erode the opposing country's military capabilities and capacity to resist. According to Russia's military doctrine, ground forces are typically deployed to secure objectives only after massive artillery bombardments combined with Air Force and missile assaults have weakened or destroyed most of the opposition. But Putin's delusions aren't the only issue in the Ukraine war. When you have a leader who's lost touch with reality and a whole crowd of people cheering "All hail the Emperor's new clothes," your kingdom is pretty much doomed. General George S. Patton used to say, "If everybody is thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking." Patton was always keenly aware that yes men, those who only tell their bosses what the boss wants to hear, aren't helpful at all, but only reinforce what the boss is already thinking. In 2022, one of Putin's most significant intelligence figures defected to the West, carrying with him a trove of important information about Putin the man, detailing his habits, his fears, and his reluctance to use any cell phones. Gleb Karakulov, who served in the Federal Protection Service, FSO, a quasi-military force tasked with protecting those officials closest to Putin, described Putin as a president who has lost touch with the world. Putin has been living in an information cocoon for the past couple of years, spending most of his time in his residences, which the media very fittingly calls bunkers. He is pathologically afraid for his life. He surrounds himself with an impenetrable barrier of quarantines and an information vacuum. He only values his own life and the lives of his family and friends. Karakulov also shed light on Putin's inner circle. Putin requires all staff working in the same room as him, and anyone who will appear close to him in photo ops, to undergo a 2-week quarantine, which severely limits the number of people who have personal access to him. Karakulov confirmed that Putin relies heavily for information on reports provided by the chiefs of his security services. Putin does not use a cell phone or the internet, and does not even bring an internet specialist with him when he travels abroad. He only receives information from his closest circle, which means that he lives in an information vacuum, Karakulov said. Okay, so we've established Putin is pretty much running his own operation into the ground. But this isn't the only reason Russia is failing in the Russo-Ukraine war. Let's talk about Russia's abysmal logistics for a second. The famous quote, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics," has been credited to everyone from Napoleon to U.S. General Omar Bradley. But the first recorded use of that phrase in that form was by a retired 4-star Marine general named Robert Hilliard Barrow. He was speaking about the difference between localized maneuvers that could win a battle and overall army supply coordination that could win or lose a war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was plagued by logistical nightmares from the very beginning. Ukraine knew they could depend on their home-designed Skiff or Stuna P anti-tank guided missile (ATGM) systems, but they also knew they'd be facing 2,000 or more Russian main battle tanks, plus more than twice that number of armored infantry fighting vehicles (IFVs). Knowing that Ukraine needed help against these armored forces, the US and its allies managed to deliver more than 17,000 anti-tank missile systems to Ukraine within the first month of the war, including the Anglo-Swedish short-range NLAW rocket and the even more powerful US-made Javelin ATGM. Ukraine was also supplied with Bayraktar TB2 drones from Turkey. Ukraine used these weapon systems not just against Russia's armored forces, but also against even more valuable targets, their fuel and ammunition vehicles. Without resupplies of ammunition, their tanks and even their infantry had to resort to more limited attacks, and without fuel, some of their armored columns ground to a halt completely. Most famous, the 40-mile-long armored column that struck south from Belarus toward Kyiv in the opening days of the war, was stalled due to a combination of stiff Ukrainian resistance, primarily ambushes from either side of the narrow penetration, combined with successful targeting of Russia's ammo and fuel trucks by both anti-tank missiles and targeted drone attacks. Military analysts who have analyzed the early months of the war have come to the conclusion that Russia completely botched its initial invasion for a variety of reasons, and that its campaign has been riddled with miscalculations, poor communication, and widespread confusion. Former CIA military analyst Jeffrey Edmonds, who is also a Russia expert at the Center for Naval Analyses, says in a recent interview, "We would have thought that they would have done a much more deliberate, well-thought-through operation. That is not what they did." Russian warfare usually involved masses of artillery pounding enemy locations, followed by massed armor and mechanized infantry assaults, combined with air support and helicopter attacks. Instead of leading with a substantial air and artillery campaign and gaining strategic superiority over Ukraine, Russian commanders apparently instructed their troops to just drive to Kyiv. The units quickly faced unexpected ambushes, repeated tactical surprise, and a logistic supply train that had not anticipated anything beyond a half-week offensive. The 40-mile traffic jam north of Kyiv underscored another recurring problem with Russian logistics. They are dependent on rail lines to move troops and support gear around their own country, but cannot link those rail lines up with their offensive advances into Ukraine. That leaves a gap between Russia's end-of-the-line ammo and fuel dumps and the Ukrainian front lines. One solution Russian commanders used to reduce that gap, and the length of time it would take to resupply forward units, was placing their supply dumps closer to the front lines. That decision turned disastrous when the U.S. began providing Ukraine with better artillery systems, including the M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, with its pinpoint accuracy out to 50 miles, twice the range of the M777 howitzer Ukraine had previously been using with its 25-mile range. But Russian commanders failed to respect the accuracy and range of HIMARS systems and continually lost weapon storage depots over and over again. Too often, Russia placed their ammunition in the same building as their troops or close by to such a location. That proved disastrous on at least one occasion, when Ukraine struck an occupied school building in Makiivka in the Donetsk region on New Year's Eve, killing as many as 400 Russian soldiers and wounding another 300, according to Ukraine claims. Another persistent problem in Russia's logistics fiasco has been the reliance on unsecured phone lines. This has allowed Ukrainian intelligence to triangulate their position and strike them with highly accurate artillery and missile strikes. One such attack reportedly left hundreds of Russian soldiers dead and prompted the Russian Ministry of Defense to announce it is already clear that the main reason of what took place included the massive use, contrary to the ban, of personal mobile phones in the range of enemy weapons. Yet such use persists, both from the average trooper to the high command. The Russian news agency TASS suggested that the New Year's Eve attack was also due to soldiers' misuse of civilian cell phones. Preliminarily, the reason for the strike was the active use of mobile phones by the newly arrived military personnel. The enemy revealed the activity of cellular communications and the location of the subscribers, which allowed them to target the temporary barracks. And then there's Russia's mass misjudgment of NATO's united front. Putin and his tiny handful of advisors also miscalculated the stiffness of NATO's resolve to defend Ukraine, as well as their willingness to arm them with every weapon system they could. Putin believed the individual countries of NATO, led by the US, Germany, France, Great Britain, and Poland, would each go their separate ways and would fail to provide a united front against what Putin expected would be a short blitzkrieg-type war. Instead, his brutal invasion solidified NATO's unity and even helped convince new countries like Finland and Sweden to ask for membership. Finland's admission, making NATO's 31st member, was an especially bitter pill to swallow, as it increased NATO's border presence with Russia by an extra 830 miles. This was clearly one of Putin's most significant blunders. The US, NATO, and the European Union have remained relatively united in providing billions of military aid to Ukraine, as well as considerable humanitarian assistance, while simultaneously applying sweeping sanctions against Russia. The sanctions have crippled the Russian economy, which took an extra hit from the loss of between 700,000 and 1 million young Russians who fled the country ahead of Putin's draft in the fall of 2022. The Russian population pyramid, already in an upside-down position with a declining birth rate and far more older citizens than young ones to replace them, is now teetering like a half-chopped-down tree, ready to collapse at any moment. Now let's get into the truly ridiculous part of our analysis of Putin's failures as a war commander: fighting a modern war using World War I tactics. By the end of the first year of the war, it became clear that in addition to all the strategic and leadership mistakes Putin and Russia have committed, there's a vast difference in how the two armies are fighting it out on the ground. While Ukraine has relied heavily on smart weapons, surveillance and attack drones, ATGMs, manpads, precision-guided munitions, even drone attack boats in the Black Sea, Russia has settled on the World War I tactic of massed artillery, followed by human waves of soldiers, often without even the benefit of a few tanks sprinkled in here and there for support. Such tactics may have worked in World War I, or even the latter stages of World War II, when the former Soviet Union had more than 1 million men under arms, and was facing a severely weakened German army that had bled white from 4 years of continuous warfare. But Ukraine has learned to adapt and overcome, and has used its precision artillery systems, especially the HIMARS artillery, to telling effect. Meanwhile, Russia has used their huge surplus of artillery to flatten cities like Bakhmut, Mariinka, and Mariupol. But the massed infantry assaults that followed leveled a horrific toll on the attackers. Estimates are that in addition to losing more than half of their pre-war stockpile of main battle tanks, Russia has lost more than 200,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Their losses in the 10-month effort to take Bakhmut have been so enormous that the Wagner private mercenary group that spearheaded the 10-month battle had to pull out of the line of combat to refit, retrain, and regroup. Some estimates say that Wagner may have lost 90% of their 80,000-man full strength. Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, will only admit to having lost 20,000 men, which is still a staggeringly high number of casualties for a city that has no inherent strategic value. While we're on the subject of losses, let's talk about the real crime and tragedy of this war. Because of the sanctions limiting Russia's access to computer chips and other resources for their high-tech industries, Russia's been unable to replace many of their advanced weapons, such as their precision munitions and state-of-the-art missiles. That's why analysts are stunned to see Putin wasting so much of its stockpiles of precision munitions on striking civilian targets. Military experts and government officials have said that Putin's terror campaign against the Ukrainian population was not a sustainable use of Russia's limited stockpiles and was unlikely to negatively affect Ukraine's will to fight. In fact, just the opposite has happened. Continued explosions in civilian areas across Ukraine, not just the capital of Kyiv, have hardened the average Ukrainian's resolve to see this fight through until every Russian soldier has been pushed out of their country. More recently, senior U.S. intelligence officials have said Russia is burning through its munitions faster than it can replace them. Officials also say the use of massive amounts of artillery and precision-guided munitions has forced Moscow to turn to Iran and North Korea for supplies. Retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus summed up just a few of the mistakes Putin has made during his invasion of Ukraine when he said, "They completely underestimated the Ukrainian forces and completely overestimated the Russian forces, and they could not impose their line of conducting a military campaign and prepare forces for conducting this campaign. In addition, they did not have modern telecommunication systems," he said, referring to their use of civilian cell phones. Therefore, the generals continued to die, commanding an army from within an intelligence vacuum, relying on sycophants and toadies rather than experts and veterans. An army sent to war without proper planning, hamstrung by poor logistics, and saddled with rampant thievery, underestimating your opponent's will to fight, misjudging NATO's united front, squandering sophisticated precision weapons on a campaign to try to break the will of a large civilian population, youth movement to leave the country, possibly for good, an economy that has been wrecked by sanctions that continue to penalize the ones who are still left day after day. It seems like Putin not only did not follow Sun Tzu's dictum to win your battles by making no mistakes, it seems like he's made practically every mistake in the book. But what do you think? What is Putin's greatest mistake in the war in Ukraine? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Russia recently lost the biggest tank battle of the entire war in Ukraine. Could it mean the beginning of Putin's defeat? This bloody battle over the small coal mining town of Vuhledar was part of the still ongoing struggle over the larger Donbas region. Vuhledar lies about 40 miles southeast of the city of Donetsk, near the pre-invasion line which divided Ukraine from the self-declared Donetsk People's Republic. And since the start of the year, Vuhledar has become a killing field for Russian armor, with the largest tank battle of the entire war taking place there over the span of 3 weeks. In that time alone, Russia lost over 130 tanks and armored vehicles, forcing Putin to rely on mass infantry assaults to try and retake the position. This was a serious blow, especially since tank warfare has been heavily mythologized in Russia since World War II and has also become symbolic of the broader conflict in Ukraine. And the Battle of Vuhledar showed yet again that the Russian military has some massive issues that won't be fixed anytime soon. Vuhledar. Even the name itself has got a kind of Lord of the Rings dark and creepy ring to it, and with good reason. Here's why. While Vuhledar has been the site of small clashes and shelling since the start of the invasion, the main battle for the town began on January 24, 2023. That night, Russia began launching assaults on Ukrainian positions, which would quickly turn into a devastating 3-week siege demonstrating Russian failures. At that point, Ukraine was still waiting for sophisticated Western tanks, like the US Abrams and German Leopard 2, to arrive. Russia's replacement armor showed up earlier, but during its first deployment in Volodar, it got absolutely decimated. Without superior firepower this time round, Ukrainians were forced to rely once again on strategy and tactics. Much of the 3 weeks took on the same pattern: pitched tank battles along dirt roads and tree lines, with Russians trying to thrust forward in columns and Ukrainians firing on them from hidden defensive positions. If this sounds familiar, it might be because Russia took the same terrible approach when trying to take Kyiv last year, costing them hundreds of tanks. Clearly, Russian commanders didn't learn much from that catastrophe and made exactly the same mistake this time around, advancing their unprotected tank columns into ambushes. So how did this latest embarrassment for Putin play out? Because the terrain around Volodar is hard to defend, consisting mostly of flat, open plains and light woods, it is hardly ideal for stopping a major assault. But Ukrainians used the terrain to their advantage and applied doctrines of combined arms warfare, which Russian war planners clearly haven't picked up on. The key to Ukraine's victory in the Battle of Volodar was in forcing Russia to fight on their terms. This meant limiting the battlefield and forcing Russian troops to attack where Ukraine wanted them to. To do so, the Ukrainian military placed hundreds of tanks and anti-personnel mines in the fields outside of Volodar. Due to the flat landscape and lack of cover, any Russian minesweepers were immediately targeted with artillery fire. But Ukrainian troops didn't just put mines everywhere. Instead, they left clear corridors between the minefields, only large enough for 2 or 3 Russian tanks at a time to roll through. If the tanks moved at all from the cleared path, they risked having their treads blown off, leaving them totally exposed to artillery strikes. But rather than try an alternate approach to get around the mines, Russian commanders made one of the most basic mistakes in all of warfare: attacking exactly where their enemy wanted them to. When Russian commanders ordered their tanks into battle along these unmined paths outside Volodar, it left them incredibly vulnerable to the same ambushes Ukrainians have employed since the start of the invasion. Hiding in covered positions near the tank columns, Ukrainian hunter-killer teams set up anti-tank missiles on both sides of the kill zone. Without triggering the anti-tank mines, these teams were able to cross the minefields and dig themselves into strategic positions, often hiding in bushes or abandoned buildings. From there they could fire and retreat with little fear of being hit by tank fire. The main tools Ukraine employed for this stage of the ambush were the domestically produced Stugna P and the American-made Javelin, both deadly anti-tank missiles or ATGMs. Sometimes called the Skiff, the Stugna P is a less advanced system, but can still pack a serious punch against unlucky tanks. The Stugna is somewhat clunky, weighing about 60 pounds, and relies on manual guidance, requiring its operator to maintain line of sight on the target while the missile is still in flight. But even with these limitations, the Stugna has shown it can be deadly, with a range of up to 3 miles and tandem high-explosive anti-tank or high-explosive fragmentary warheads capable of penetrating modern composite tank armor. The Javelin has proven to be even more successful at obliterating Russian tanks. Manufactured by American defense giants Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, the Javelin has an effective range of more than 8,000 feet and employs a fire-and-forget targeting system, allowing its operator to flee to safety after firing. Once in flight, the Javelin's missile locks onto the infrared signature of its target and flies in one of 2 flight modes: top attack or direct attack. While its direct attack mode is similar to the Stugna, the Javelin's top attack mode has proven to be the most deadly against Russian tanks. In this configuration, the missile travels in a high arc, coming down on the top of the least protected section of the tank, just above its barrel. Like the Stugna, the Javelin also features a tandem warhead charge, using a smaller initial blast to penetrate hundreds of millimeters of armor, while the second charge creates a cone of superplastically deformed metal, which can shred the inside of a tank like paper. Both of these ATGM systems were put to good use outside of Volodar. Among these responsible was Lieutenant Vladislav Bayek, the deputy commander of Ukraine's 1st Mechanized Battalion of the 72nd Brigade, which inflicted much of the damage on Russian armor. Working out of a bunker in Vuhledar, Lieutenant Bayek used a drone to spot the first column of 15 Russian tanks and armored personnel vehicles. "We were ready," he said. "We knew something like this would happen." The Russian officers, meanwhile, clearly did not. Lieutenant Bayek waited until the tanks were strung out between the mined fields before ordering a lightning ambush with the command, "To battle!" Stugner and Javelin operators hiding in the tree lines along the fields opened fire, as did hidden artillery positions further from the road, using American M777 and French Caesar howitzers. Each team was assigned a different section of the Russian column to fire on, focusing on the front and back vehicles first to create a bottleneck. The result was devastating. Tanks in the column attempted to turn and escape the ambush, only to blow up on the mine-laden shoulder of the road. In turn, each destroyed vehicle made it harder for the rest of the column to escape, with blown-up vehicles forming their own roadblock. At that point, Ukrainian artillery would open fire on the trapped tanks, killing the Russians who tried to flee from their trapped vehicles. It ended in obliteration. For 3 weeks this pattern repeated itself, with Russia losing more and more tanks and, incredibly, refusing to change tactics. At one point, Russian tanks became so stuck that Ukrainians were even able to call in a strike by a HIMARS rocket system, usually only effective against stationary targets like ammunition depots. Ukraine also made excellent use of its own older tanks as well. Because they couldn't outgun the Russian armor head-on, Ukrainians dug their tanks into hidden defensive positions. Some were concealed with bushes and camouflage netting, while others were actually buried in the soil, leaving only their turrets. While not effective against top-attack munitions, these dug-in defensive positions dramatically increased the survivability of Ukraine's tanks from head-on fire. And because Ukrainians knew exactly where the Russian tank columns would advance, they were able to range the entire approach for their hidden tanks and artillery. This allowed them to make strikes onto predetermined firing points with high levels of accuracy and not waste their limited ammunition. During each ambush, Ukrainian tank crews also used a range of extremely clever tactics to problem-solve and avoid having their positions detected. The tanks couldn't wait with their engines turned on without giving themselves away through thermal signature or engine noise, but needed to stay warm to be quickly fired up for combat. So Ukrainians placed kerosene-burning heaters next to their engines to keep the tanks ready to go on a moment's notice. Similarly, their hidden positions meant that many Ukrainian tank crews did not have a line of sight to their targets, so they improvised by using drone operators to sight in their attacks. This also added an extra level of confusion for the already bewildered Russian forces, as their front lines were pummeled with unseen tank fire. Their own tanks couldn't locate where to return fire, leaving them essentially blind and helpless. If the Russian columns managed to escape the mines, ATGMs, artillery, and hidden tank positions, Ukraine just used drones to shift their firing positions to fleeing troops and vehicles. And for any tanks that actually managed to retreat back through the kill zone, Ukraine had yet another deadly surprise waiting. In one of its recent shipments of military aid, the United States supplied Ukraine with up to 10,000 specially modified 155mm artillery shells, each filled with 9 individual anti-tank mines and a magnetic detonator. Known as Remote Anti-Armor Mine Systems, or RAMs, these terrifying weapons were used to mop up any surviving Russian tanks. When a fleeing column would exit the rear of the kill zone, another group of hidden Ukrainian gunners opened fire on their rear, once again trapping them with a rain of anti-tank mines. By employing this strategy again and again against Russians who refused to try other approaches, you can see how Ukrainian defenders destroyed over 100 tanks and armored vehicles in a matter of weeks around Vuhledar. After a few successful ambushes, it also became clear to Ukrainian commanders that the Russians are running out of experienced tank crews and commanders alike. One Russian tank commander captured outside of Vuhledar turned out to be a medic who had been given a brief crash course and then sent to the front lines. Because successfully operating even an older tank takes several months of specialized training, there was little chance that the former medic would do anything but get himself killed or captured. And this wasn't a one-off, but a repeating pattern, with almost every Russian officer captured near Vuhledar having little to no experience in battle. And incredibly, the tank crews these officers were commanding appeared to be even greener. Most were made up of recent conscripts who had, at best, a passing familiarity with whatever vehicle they were operating. This astonishing lack of qualified personnel, while far from surprising, is yet another sign that the Russian war effort is falling apart. Russia lost nearly all of its experienced tank crews during the spring of 2022 during the disastrous assault on Kyiv. The limited number who survived those early ambushes were sent back to the east of the country as Putin limited his war effort. But those survivors were once again decimated during the wildly successful Ukrainian counteroffensive last fall. During that period, the most elite of Russia's remaining tank units, the 1st Guards Tank Army, was nearly destroyed outside the northern city of Liman. This was the best trained and equipped Russian tank force operating in Ukraine and was supposed to easily hold captured territory. Considering that even this elite unit was not up to the task, it's no surprise that the green Russian troops sent to Volodar have fared so badly. This is a sharp contrast with Ukrainian forces, many of whom were green and terrified when they were drafted or volunteered to defend their country last February. Even though many of those defending Volodar were relatively recent recruits, they learned on the go and didn't make the same mistake twice. Most of Ukraine's most experienced tank crews are currently elsewhere in Eastern Europe, learning to operate the advanced Leopard 2 and M1 Abrams tanks. Yet even the relatively untested troops defending Volodar were able to pull off another staggering victory. This is a pretty clear indication that the war has decisively turned in Ukraine's favor, both in terms of equipment and personnel. It's also yet another reminder of just how poor Russian military doctrine and planning is turning out to be, as neither field officers nor top military brass seem able to learn from past mistakes. Part of this difficulty likely comes from the very structure of the Russian military, which is made up of multiple, independently commanded parts. This lack of a unified command structure has plagued Russia for years, and appears to be at least part of the reason why new conscripts are not warned against walking into obvious ambushes. Similarly, the seasoned troops which should theoretically be spearheading such an assault appear to be in much worse shape than expected. A recent intelligence report from the UK found that Russia sent another elite unit, the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, into the fighting around Volodar. This force is supposed to be among the deadliest in Russia, and was utilized in the largest battles last year. But the 155th suffered so many losses that even before Volodar, it was on its third personnel restaffing since the start of the war. As a result, this supposedly first-class fighting force is now staffed mostly by fresh recruits. Adding to the dysfunction is the fact that the 155th was apparently not being sent into combat together, but instead broken up into smaller units and integrated with other commands. Rather than the desired effect of boosting other units' battle readiness, the decision simply made the 155th entirely ineffective. It certainly doesn't help that Russia is rapidly running out of precision-guided munitions and other war supplies. As a result, Russian forces were unable to eliminate the Ukrainian artillery and ATGM positions before their assault on Volodar, assuming they could force their way into the town regardless. Another reason behind Russia's repeated failures in Volodar and elsewhere relates to its heavy use of private military contractors, or PMCs. The most notorious of these is the Wagner Group, headed by Putin confidant Yevgeny Prigozhin. Putin's reliance on Wagner and other groups, as well as the rampant corruption in Russia, has led to a scenario where each is directly competing for the spoils of war. Volodar is near two massive coal mines, one of the main reasons why Russia has spent so much time and blood trying to take the town. But since its resources would only likely be given to one PMC, there is a strong incentive to fight over spoils. So at Volodar, the official Russian military, the Wagner Group, and the Patriot PMC, controlled directly by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, have all been competing to make the town their own. As a consequence, none of these groups shared information over the potential ambushes, each hoping that the other would take most of the casualties, leaving them free to take over and plunder the town. Controlling the near 70 million tons of coal underneath Volodar would make either Prigozhin or Shoigu far wealthier than they currently are, giving them $1 billion reason not to cooperate. Of course, this dynamic isn't great for an effective fighting force, and has left Russia at a significant information disadvantage. There's another political dimension to Russia's failure in Volodar as well. It's clear to pretty much everyone but the Russians that the smart move would have been to move elsewhere and avoid the potential of mines and ambushes. Yet Russian commanders have insisted on bizarre pitched assaults, possibly because of Putin's desperate need for a political win. Anywhere Russian forces have been ground to a halt, the political importance of not appearing to lose a battle has come to outweigh the strategic importance of withdrawing and maneuvering around static defenses. Doing so would be yet another signal of weakness, especially to Putin's most hardline supporters of the invasion. But even so, after the staggering loss at Vuhledar, cracks are starting to show. Russian military bloggers, a vocally pro-war group, have fiercely criticized the endless failed tank assaults. Grey Zone, a Telegram channel close to the Wagner Group, posted in early March that relatives of the dead are inclined almost to murder and blood revenge against the general who was in charge at Vuhledar. And while the Ukrainian armed forces can be glad of Russia's staggering incompetence, we should never forget the terrible price paid by places like Vuhledar. By the end of the Russian assault in February, the town's deputy mayor stated that Vuhledar was destroyed, with 100% of the buildings damaged. Of the town's original population of 15,000, less than 500 remain, mostly squatting in ruins and collecting rainwater to drink. While there is no doubt that the battle was a tactical victory for Ukraine, it will also take many, many years before anything can be rebuilt. In any case, it is more than clear that the war's trajectory has changed in Ukraine's favor, and that Russia cannot suffer too many more defeats like this one. But what do you think? Was Vuhledar a turning point in the war? And will Russia's repeated failures eventually doom Putin's ambitions? Let us know what you think in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.